Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, I watched my Gramps rubbing his magnificent full white beard, wiping the beads of perspiration that had gathered on his forehead. A nervous result, he informed us, of remembering the story he was about to tell us, that over the years had made him break out in hives whenever he recalled the direful events of that horrifying night when he was a mere boy of 12 years old. He smiled at us through his Arctic blue eyes that were so piercing that you could be forgiven for thinking he was looking right through you. At times it almost felt as if he actually was. I could tell he had an arresting, riveting and gripping story to tell us, but he was biding his time, as all stories need to be told in the perfect idyllic setting. But could an ambient contexture be more perfect than this one? I didn't think so. My name is Wallace, by the way, although some people call me Wally. Me and my sister Paula were seated outside on the ground on soft cushions around a roaring fire pit, while my Gramps was sitting on an old tree stump that he was using as a makeshift stool. I've always preferred sitting on the ground rather than on a rickety camping chair. And I'm sorry, but in my opinion, I don't care how good your camping chair actually is. Most of them are pretty unstable. I like to be able to tug the grass with my hands, feel close to the earthen floor, even smell the faint, sweet scent of the grass. On a chair, you miss out on all that. It's like the difference between eating with your hands or with a knife and fork. The taste of a metal fork can rob the natural flavours of the food. It's the same thing, really. It was a velvety black night, the sky so awe-inspiring, so beautiful, so black. Not if you were venturing out on your own, of course, would this night be beautiful, but for a gripping story, the night was hauntingly provocative. There was a scattering of bright silvery stars sparkling in the sky, a white glowing half-crescent moon that bespeckled the night, with just enough light to leave your imagination running wild in an excited frenzy, creating scary, suggestive, ghost-like beings in your head that you could envisage creeping through the dark shadows, staring at you through insidiously hollow eyes from between the trees. I loved being scared stiff, but I wanted to be scared out of my mind in a safe place where the excited tingles of my fear would leave me titillated, galvanized into an intoxicating excited stupor. Beyond the backyard of my grandfather's rustic timber cabin, that was as quaint as it was whimsical, the ominous towering silhouettes of the tall Douglas fir trees moved against a still breeze. They looked like clusters of tall, menacing giants, gathered together under the full moon. They seemed to whisper to each other as their needled boughs swayed backwards and forwards in the wind. My grandfather stoked the fire pit. The flames hissed in response. They grew higher. The fire crackled, red, orange, yellow. It burnt brightly. We watched as the timber beams buckled, folded, curled and spitted. It was strangely hypnotic. "Well, dear," said my grandmother, "how long are you going to keep us all in suspense, sweetheart? Our grandchildren are itching to hear a good story from you this evening." A good story, I corrected, but a true one, Gramps. I'm not going to tell my story until you've seated yourself down, sweetheart, said my Gramps, eyeing my grandmother warily. You've got ants in your pants this evening. Why don't you settle down like the rest of us? Very well, said my grandmother, pulling up an old tree stump to sit on. I'm all ears. My grandmother was a woman in her early 80s, but she was as fit as anyone in their 50s, with a back so straight that it would make a pencil look crooked. But while her body was robust, the lines on her wizened face spoke of a life well lived, with creases around her eyes, laugh lines around her cheeks, and deep furrows crinkling her forehead. I watched her smiling as her pale face lit up like a bright light. The lines around her cheeks and her eyes became further accentuated into deep grooves, for she was a woman who laughed a lot. She sat back on the stump as eager to hear my Gramps tell his story, almost as much as we were. I glanced around at our environment, drinking it in like the delicious creamy chocolate of a milkshake in a straw. It didn't get better than this, I thought, as I saw the bright yellow light of my grandparents' wooden cabin twinkling under the dark sky, while I could hear the night filled with an orchestra of crickets, frogs, and in the distance we could hear the occasional yap of a coyote or a howl of a wolf. Was this how cosy and snug it felt in the days of old, I wondered, when the family gathered around a fire to hear a great story, told by one of the family elders? In my opinion, it was so much better than watching a television program, as storytelling engages your senses, leaves you always pondering, what if? All was quiet as eyes focused on my Gramps, as he began to tell us his story. Well, when I was a young boy of about 12 years old, I begged my father to let me come coon hunting with him. It was in those woods over there, he said, gesturing towards the trees of the vast wood grove that surrounded his property and branched out towards an old logging road. And yet beyond that there were still more trees, as well as a pretty little creek. As you well know, I grew up in this cabin on this plot of land, and during the day I spent all my time in the woods. But I've never experienced them at night. The idea intrigued me. I would say perhaps a little more than intrigued. It excited me. I'd never explored those woods at night before. Growing up, we heard all kinds of stories about the woods. People had seen strange orbs glowing through the trees. There had been reports of people having encounters with the fae. But I took all those stories with a pinch of salt. My father was very annoyed by the growing coon population on our property. He claimed they were pinching the grain from the barn, so he believed the numbers could well do with being managed. At the time his brother Russell was staying at the cabin with us, so the three of us ambled happily into the woods together, with our two family dogs, Jasper and Giles. The two rambunctious, very lively mixed-breed retriever dogs were incredibly excited, as even before the hunt they were jumping up and down exuberantly on their paws, while thrashing the floor with their tails in eager expectation. The two dogs had been on a plethora of coon hunts before, were heartily consummate and proficient at the hunt, knew what was expected of them. They were skilled in picking up the scent of the coons with their sharp noses, so that we could easily hunt our quarry. So armed with rifles and night lights, we entered the woods. I could see my father wasn't too thrilled that I was coming along for the ride, but he knew that I would be crushed if I wasn't allowed to come. Besides, my mother had persuaded them to take me. It's good for our son to understand the woods at night, she explained. The woods were indeed very different at night. Everything was so dark beyond our lights. All was dense, thick and black, while shadows moved through the trees. You always sensed you were being watched, even if you weren't. Before long the dogs were on the trail, with their noses pinned to the ground, as they sprung into the woods, whizzing past us. We could hear them way ahead of us, making a raucous commotion. They were jumping up and down a large tree trunk, their heads cocked up to the upper branches. We thought the coons were in that tree. That is what we assumed the dogs were so enthused about. But we looked in the tree branches to see not a coon as we had expected, but a very frightened-looking creature with big, bright brown eyes sitting on a branch. It was tiny, about the size of a little toddler, but it was covered in dark brown hair with overlong arms and a human-looking face. The creature looked scared out of its wits, and it began climbing the tree higher to get away. It was making a whimpering sound, while the two dogs were in a frenzy, barking up at the tree, losing all interest in continuing with the coon hunt. Whatever was up that tree was infinitely more interesting to them than chasing a raccoon. It was clear the dogs were completely fascinated by this arousing new scent, interested in this strange creature. Their excitable barking escalated. I remember my grandfather looking at us and saying, "What the heck is that creature? Did you see how human the face is?" His feverish dogs were still barking deliriously around the tree. You could hear the little distraught whimpers of the tiny thing that was clearly very afraid. It was dangling on one branch with its overlong arm like orangutan. All of a sudden we heard something prodigious blasting through the woods at one hell of a speed, banging, pounding, booming and slamming the ground so hard under its massive feet. It sounded as if a colossal bulldozer was thundering towards us, or a couple of powerful rhino. Whatever was coming our way was very big. Our 2 dogs began to whimper, but they hightailed it back to the cabin with their tails between their legs. Those dogs were terrified and had no intention of staying around. They were clever dogs. They could sense and feel danger. My grandpa and his brother were shaking in their boots. You would think we would have run away, but the sound of that thing thumping the forest floor as it headed towards us immobilized us, as if we'd been tasered. We became disorientated and confused. I remember my father began to tremble violently. His eyes grew wide with horror. He cried out, "Something big is coming towards us! We need to get out of here now!" My father's brother looked as white as a ghost, as if all the colour had drained from his skin, while I stood there unable to comprehend what was actually happening. But I humiliated myself immeasurably by discovering that a warm liquid was running down my legs. I had wet myself. It was awfully embarrassing. Despite my father telling us to get the hell out of there, none of us moved a single muscle, or even tried to escape. For some reason we just couldn't. I don't even know exactly why. It was like we were frozen in the fabric of time, like 3 people in a still photograph. Whatever was moving towards us began shaking the branches of the trees vigorously. We could hear tree limbs cracking, snapping and breaking all around us. That was when we saw her. We realized at once that this was the mother of the creature we'd seen sitting in the tree. She was absolutely enormous, strong, lofty, majestic. She stood up on 2 feet, was easily over 8 foot tall, with the most enormous, rounded, well-developed shoulders that I've ever seen, that were easily 3 feet in width across. She had arms so long that they fell beyond her knees. Her body was so powerfully built like a solid piece of farming machinery, while her legs were stocky, robust like tree trunks. She was covered in long, fine hair. She looked human with some ape-like influences to her appearance. For a moment we stared at her in a stupefied, wondrous awe, while she stared back at us. Her deep-set dark eyes glittered with a red eye-shine. She appeared worried, as her discerning, intelligent eyes hovered over my Gramps and his brother's rifles. It was clear she knew what they were. She wasn't at all happy. She was possibly afraid that we might use them on her, when that was the last thing on our minds. All any of us were thinking about was getting the hell out of there as quickly as we could, hopefully still in one piece. The creature let out a huge, ear-piercing roar that was so terrifying it jolted us out of our senses. "Run!" my father shouted. "Run as fast as you can!" For some unexplainable reason, both men dropped their rifles to the ground. Their hands became limp, and their rifles just fell out of their hands. Something they've never been able to explain or comprehend. It was an involuntary action. They began to run with me following behind them. The creature began to chase us, but she was so fast, I'm in no doubt she could have easily caught up with us if she'd really wanted to. I think she wanted to scare us off. She fully succeeded in her endeavours. I just remember being so terrified, my heart was pounding violently in my ears, and the adrenaline was pumping in my blood so fast that I even overtook my father in the race back to the cabin. When we got to the cabin, the dogs were cowering outside the door, begging to be let inside. My father thrust the door open wide. We bolted into the cabin, locking doors and windows behind us in an alarmed frenzy, and then collapsing on the sofa in an exhausted heap, struggling to find our breaths. My father was trembling and saying that there was a monster out there, that we had to remain in the house, as this creature could potentially kill us. My mother, who'd been sleeping, was very annoyed to be woken up by 2 grown men that were in such a dreadful state. She firmly told everyone to calm down and to stop overreacting. She wanted to know what all the fuss was about, but the men were panicking so much she couldn't get a word out of them. I told her that we'd seen a very big hairy lady in the woods. We could see the silhouette of the creature walking around our cabin. She was roaring indignantly, tapping our windows with her hands. She sounded incredibly upset. Everything in the cabin began to shake and quiver under that terrifying sound. My mother's crystal glasses on the dresser in the living room began to wobble precariously, while my father and his brother continued to tremble with fear. We could see the creature pressing her face against the window, looking inside at us with furious eyes. Finally, everything went quiet as the creature decided to return to the woods. In those days we didn't know what we had seen, but nowadays we know the creature was a Bigfoot. My mother made everyone some brandy to calm them down. Everything became silent. The sounds of frogs and crickets then resumed. The following morning it was a beautiful sunny day. I think my father and his brother felt a little silly about their behaviour the previous night, as the cold light of day puts everything into perspective. However, when they walked around the cabin, they saw huge footprints in the mud that were easily over 18 inches long, only expressing how big this creature must have been. My mother was preparing blueberry pancakes for breakfast the following morning. She asked us why we'd been so petrified the previous night, why we'd been terrified out of our skins. She'd heard the creature roaring outside the cabin and tapping on our windows, so she knew we'd encountered something quite substantial. She asked us to tell us exactly what had happened. We told her about the whimpering little creature in the tree, and about the very angry mother. We were surprised when my grandmother took the Bigfoot's side. "Do you realise what you did?" she scolded. "You scared a poor little youngling. It must have been terrified out of its wits, with the dogs yapping around the tree like that, and you all just ogling it. Poor thing. I'm sorry to say, but I have huge sympathy for the creature, and not much for you lot. You handled the situation like bundling idiots. You should have called the dogs off at once, got the hell out of there, shown the creature some respect. Instead, you caused mayhem and disturbed the peace. No wonder the mother came after you to scare you off and warn you not to go upsetting her youngling. I would have reacted exactly the same way if it had been my youngling," she told us. "I think we should make amends. We need to reach out to the creature and apologise. I'll make her some cookies. Do you realise we have to live in harmony with nature? We can't go upsetting these things that live around us in the woods. We don't want to create enemies for ourselves." "Don't be ridiculous, Isabel," my father said. "Have you lost leave of your senses? We can't go befriending wild animals. We don't even know what the strange creature is. And our rifles are in that woodland. I'm reluctant to go and get them after what we experienced last night. You don't even know she could still be out there, waiting to pounce on us at any moment." "Oh, don't be so ridiculous, Paul. You do make a mountain out of a molehill about things. You're talking absolute nonsense. If the creature really wanted to hurt you, I dare say she would have done so already. Do you really think that she couldn't outrun you last night? Of course she could. She wanted to give you a jolly good scare. As far as I'm concerned, you all deserved it." "You're being completely unreasonable, Isabella. You don't know what this thing was like. It was a monster." "Correction, Paul. It was an upset, protective mother. That's what it was." My mother took no notice of her husband and brother. She asked me to help her bake some cinnamon raisin and oat cookies, which I did. I remember we made a huge batch of cookies, and my grandmother asked me to show her where the tree was that we'd seen the youngling, so I went with her into the woods. I remember it felt as if we were being watched, but we looked around and saw nothing there. We looked up the tree where the previous night I'd seen the youngling, but there was no sign of the little creature. But we left the cookies under the tree, in a large Tupperware container. We also looked for the 2 missing rifles, but they were gone, nowhere to be seen. We realised the creature must have moved them. My mother just stood there and said out loud, "Ma'am, I'd just like to apologise on behalf of my husband, his brother, the dogs and my son for upsetting your little youngling last night. I brought you some cookies to express my extreme apologies. We would really like to coexist with you in peace." I remember saying to my mother that there was no way those creatures could hear us, and even if they could, they probably wouldn't understand what we were saying anyway. She said to me stranger things have happened, that I should never underestimate the natural world and its magic. That night my father and his brother retired to bed early, locking all the cabin windows and doors behind them. They had a couple of spare rifles that they kept by the door, in case the creature might come back. Their demeanour changed again the moment that it got dark, as the memory of the previous night came flooding back to them. The dogs also became unduly nervous, so everybody stayed indoors. But that night nothing happened, although at one time during the night the dogs began to bark. My father and his brother were pleasantly surprised that the angry, belligerent mother had not come back. The following morning, when my grandmother got up, we discovered the rifles that belonged to my father had been returned. We found them lying across the step on the front porch, along with a Tupperware container that had been filled with cookies. In its place were 2 big rainbow trout, which my mother cooked for breakfast that morning. They were the most delicious fish I've ever tasted. We knew they were a gift from the creature. We were moved by her generosity, that she'd been so quick to accept our apology. My mother said, "You see, it's about living in harmony with nature. If you respect other living things, they in turn will respect you." Of course, she was absolutely right. We could have made an enemy out of the creature, but in the end we had turned her into a friend. My father was completely mystified that the creature had responded so positively to my mother's gesture of kindness. After that we never had any problems with the Bigfoots in the wood, but very frequently my mother would bake them cookies. They often left us fish in exchange. We never physically saw the Bigfoots again, but we knew they were there, although my mother saw the Bigfoot female on one occasion. It happened after Giles had been diagnosed with cancer by the vet. One day he just disappeared. We imagined he'd gone off somewhere to die, as that is what animals tend to do. We were upset because we would have liked to have buried Giles in our backyard, but he was nowhere to be seen. That was when my mother saw the Bigfoot carrying Giles's dead body towards her. She brought it to the front porch, wrapping the body in a deerskin, covering it with a few green boughs. She said she locked eyes with the Bigfoot for a moment, and that the creature had the most beautiful brown eyes, filled with such compassion. The creature put Giles on the ground and glided away. She said she knew the Bigfoot understood that Giles was a big loss to our family. We were so happy to have his body back, to bury in our yard, which is invariably what we did. "Wow, Gramps," I said, "that's an incredible story. Do you think there are Bigfoots still living in your wood grove?" "Well, I personally haven't seen any more Bigfoots. The last time I saw one was when I was 12 years old, and that was a long time ago." "That was a wonderful story," I said. We all agreed. At the time we were staying in my Gramps' cabin outside Manitoba in Canada, as my parents, who lived in Toronto, were going through a very ugly divorce at the time. My mother believed it would be better for me and my sister to get out of their hair while they sorted out their differences. While I loved both my parents, I couldn't fathom why 2 such different people had tied the knot in the first place. I was 12 years old at the time, and I could see that my parents were incongruous in every regard. My sister believed my parents had been initially physically attracted to each other, which was why they got together. I'd seen pictures of my mother as a young woman, and she was quite pretty, so maybe that was true. My father was a quiet man who was self-effacing and never said a single word. He liked to sink into the shadows and disappear, while my mother liked to be the life and soul of the party. My mother began to resent my father's reclusive behaviour. Imagine Tigger in The Wind in the Willows getting together with a very big lazy tortoise. The two are never going to connect. It was like that with my parents. My mother and father were at each other's throats all the time. My mother complaining bitterly that my dad was boring, as he never wanted to paint the town red. My father complaining that my mother was way too social. I even said to my parents, "You both want different things. Why did you ever marry?" They couldn't even answer that question. I had no regrets that my parents were parting ways. On the contrary, I welcomed their decision, as I just wanted to live in harmony, just like my Gramps' mother wanted to live seamlessly with the Bigfoots. I think that's what humans crave, to live in peace. I enjoyed staying with my grandparents, and after my Gramps' amazing story, I was hoping that me and my sister might spot a Bigfoot. The trouble is that I've often found that in life when you look for something, you don't always find it. Sometimes it comes to you when you least expect it, or in a way you never imagined. It happened to us again, in the form of another Bigfoot story. A very good friend of my grandmother's, a lady called Joyce Malinsky, lived in a cabin not too far away from my grandparents. She popped over to visit one day. She'd known my grandmother for many years. She was a very interesting woman in her early 70s, who dyed her hair a deep auburn colour. She had bright blue eyes, but unlike my grandmother, her back was a little hunched over. She struggled to walk, so she used a walking stick. But despite her physical impediments, she didn't want to settle for a safe, pampered life living in a town. She was surprised to see me and my sister were staying at the cabin, but my grandparents explained that my parents were going through an ugly divorce. "I see," she said, looking at us sympathetically. "Don't be sad," she said. "I know it's difficult when one's parents split up, but sometimes it's for the best." "I'm glad they're splitting up," I told her, "because I'm tired of all their fighting and arguing. I love living in peace. Things will be better if they go their separate ways." "You've got a wise one here," said Joyce, smiling at me brightly. "Have you ever seen a Bigfoot?" I asked her. I don't know why I came up with such a bizarre question, but I did. She looked at me with a startled expression on her face. I knew at once she'd seen a Bigfoot before. "What a strange thing to ask," she said, avoiding my gaze, as if she didn't want to directly answer my question. "It's not really that strange," my grandmother said. "The kids got very excited the other night when Gramps told them about an encounter he had as a young boy with a female Bigfoot, so my grandchildren have been trying to explore the woodgrove for a Bigfoot sighting." "Have you found anything?" asked Joyce. "No," I said, "nothing. But you've seen a Bigfoot, I know you have." "How do you know?" she asked, looking surprised. "Your expression," I told her. "When I asked you if you'd seen one, I could tell by the recognition in your eyes." "It's true, I have seen one," said Joyce. "I regret to have to tell you that the first time I saw a Bigfoot, it was actually dead." "You're joking," I said. "No, I'm not," she said. "It's a very sad story. My husband was out in the woods. He discovered this dead Bigfoot lying on the ground. He touched the body, discovered the creature was still warm. He realized that the strange, anomalous creature had died, possibly only moments before. I'm not sure what it had died of, as there were no signs of physical injuries on the creature, or its succumbing to some kind of disease. But I will say this, it looked wasted, as if it was very old. I'm not sure why I would say it looked old, but it did. Its hair was grey. Its skin was exceedingly wrinkled like an elderly person, although it was a very leathery skin, so the furrows were very deep. At the time, he didn't know what it was, nor did I. It was 1984. We'd never heard about Bigfoots before. I remember my husband bolted into the cabin. He said to me, "Joyce, you've got to come and see this. There's a very, very peculiar-looking creature lying dead in the woods. Its body is still warm. I think it's only just died. It looks like a human covered in hair, with some primate-like qualities. I've never seen anything like this before. Are you coming or not?" I must admit I was very beguiled, eager to see what it was my husband had discovered. Over the years living in this part of the world, we've seen unorthodox things before, so I followed him into the woods. My husband warned me to be very quiet, in case there were other creatures like that around. He said this thing was monstrously big, so his kind could be a potential threat. I remember being fascinated when we found the body lying there in the woods on the earthen floor. I picked up the arm. It felt so heavy as it flopped back on the ground. The eyes stared vacantly into space. I remember those eyes were a treacle brown colour. I was very impressed by the size of this thing. Although I believe the creature was very old, it was at the very least 700 pounds and 8 foot tall, with the most humongous shoulders I've ever seen. As we were standing over the dead body, we could hear something coming. Whoever or whatever it was appeared to be whistling. It sounded exactly like a human whistle, but me and my husband instinctively chose to hide, taking cover behind the trees. What we witnessed next was the saddest thing that I've ever seen. A very large creature emerged through the trees. I believe she was also old. That was the impression I got. She looked much like the old man, but was standing upright on 2 feet, was whistling happily. Then she stopped dead in her tracks. Her whistling also stopped, as she saw the dead Bigfoot lying on the ground, motionless. She glided towards the creature with a perplexed expression on her face and began to shake it vigorously, but obviously it did not respond. My heart melted with such a tender empathy and sadness towards her. I realized she was going through such a deep melancholia, poor thing, for this was her lifelong partner. The creature got onto her haunches, was cradling the dead corpse in her arms, rocking it backwards and forwards like a baby. She whimpered. The whimpering escalated to a howl. I was standing there behind the tree, bawling my eyes out, as this large creature was so devastated. Her heart was completely broken. I could feel her tormented pain. My husband was indicating for us to leave the woods, to leave her alone to grieve in peace. I do remember in the weeks that followed we would hear a wailing sound in the forest for a long time. I said to my husband, "That's the hairy lady. She's grieving the loss of her partner." One day my husband called me again to the woods. We found a huge mound there that looked like a burial plot. It had been marked with sticks. I remember I took flowers to the mound and left them on the grave. I also planted some daffodil bulbs around the grave so that in spring the area was covered in daffodils. It was my way of saying goodbye to the old fellow. Every year on the exact date of the creature's death, I would visit that mound and put flowers on the grave. One year I even put a wreath. The creature died on the 23rd of June, 1984. I never ever forgot that date. It must have been 10 years later in 1994 when my husband was chopping firewood. He told me he was suffering from some heartburn, so I told him to relax and come inside for a coffee. He told me he was feeling a lot better and went out to resume his wood chopping. Then all of a sudden he began to clasp his heart. He stumbled to the ground. I ran over to him and started doing CPR on him, but he'd gone. He died of a heart attack. It was ironic, as only a week before he'd visited the doctor for a general checkup, was given a clean bill of health, so my husband having this unexpected heart attack was a bolt out of the blue. He was an exceedingly healthy man in the prime of life, so why he died so unexpectedly like that was beyond me. Of course the emergency services arrived on the scene, but there was nothing anyone could do. But the extraordinary thing was that the very next day after he died, I opened up my cabin door and found a circular mound of soil had been dug up. Surrounded by large stones, planted in the middle of the circle, was a little oak tree. I began to bawl my eyes out, as I was moved by this kind gesture. I knew that the Bigfoot was sharing in my grief. She obviously knew what had happened to my husband. I realized that she had created this mound and planted the tree. Over the years she must have seen me visiting the grave, putting flowers on it to remember her loved one. Now in my pain she was doing exactly the same for me. That tree is now a small oak planted outside my cabin. Whenever I look at it, I'm reminded of my husband, and I'm reminded of the Bigfoots. "You never told me this story, Joyce," said my grandmother, bustling around the kitchen to make her some tea. "I suppose I never wanted to tell anyone the story, until now, when your grandson prodded me. I'm glad I did," I said. "That's one of the most beautiful stories I've ever heard." "I had no idea," said my grandmother. "To think that beautiful oak outside your cabin is actually planted by a Bigfoot." "Do you still put flowers on the burial mound?" I asked Joyce. "Not any more. The mound no longer is there. It's because it's part of the landscape now. The land's flattened out. But when I go to the area and I find clusters of daffodils, I know that's the spot where the old Bigfoot was buried." I was told these stories when I was a 12-year-old boy. Sadly, all those people I'm talking about that shared the story with me are long since deceased, but the story still lives on in my heart, and I hope it will live in yours too. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners. "Mrs. Bromaway, are you there?" came the voice. I was shaking violently as I clutched my cell phone in my hands, holding it tightly to my chest, so much so that my fingers began to ache and perspiration broke out feverishly on my palms. The cell that I was holding became slippery in my fingers, as if I was manually holding a block of butter that was beginning to melt in my hands. I had the speakerphone on,
Mrs. Bromaway, came the voice again. Can you hear me? Hello? 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 Mrs. Bromaway, can you hear me? Are you still there, Mrs. Bromaway?
I could hear the man clearly. Of course I could. His deep baritone voice expressed concern. I could hear him speaking to someone in the background. His wife, I suspected.
I don't know if I've lost the connection with her or not. I can't hear a thing. There's no clicking sound that you would expect to hear when a call finishes. Do you think I should disconnect this call? Try phoning her back, perhaps. Sweetheart, I'm sure she's still there. She's probably in shock after what you've told her, came a woman's gentle voice. Just remain patiently on the line with her. I'm sure the poor lady is digesting the news. Just be a little patient, will you? That's the problem. I'm not sure she still is there, said the man, sighing with exasperation. It might just be a dodgy connection. Do you think I should try again? Maybe she dropped the phone out of her hands or something. People do that a lot when they've had a nasty shock. Should I call her again? What should I do? I would hold on a little longer if I were you, the woman encouraged. Just give her a chance to speak. Hello, repeated the male voice. Are you still there, Mrs. Bromaway? Can you hear me? If you can, please speak up for me, because I can't hear you at all. I'm worried this is a dodgy line or something, but it's very important that I speak with you. There is stuff we need to discuss. I've been trying to get hold of you for several days now. I know what I've just told you is devastating, and you have our deepest sympathy, Mrs. Bromaway, but it's critical that we talk.
Tears spilled down my cheeks unabashedly. It was as if the floodgates of my grief were beginning to open up, almost as if sandbags on a river bank would be not enough to block the overflow. Yet despite this, I made no obvious noise. My tears remained stiffly silent. There was no blubbering or sniffing on my part. I was frozen in place, like a statue at an extravagant banquet, that was incompetently disabled from expressing my despair, as if it was all locked away inside of me. But the cracks in the ice were beginning to show, and slowly but surely the ice started to melt. I couldn't believe this was actually happening, especially not to me. This was the sort of thing that played itself out in the movies, not in ordinary people's lives. I must be dreaming. Of course, that's what this was about. I was probably lying blissfully fast asleep in my bed in the upstairs bedroom, next to my husband Freddie. At this moment I was entangled in a gruesome nightmare, rather like a fly caught up in the silken fibres of a spider web, trying to wrestle its way out. But I was about to wake up in any second. I would soon laugh at myself for the futility of it all. Honestly, what was I like? I'd likely say to my husband Freddie, "You'll never believe what I dreamed last night. It was so lucidly real." Freddie would regard me enviously.
It's not fair. Why do you always have such graphic dreams, Jamie? Why doesn't that happen to me? Do you realize how lucky you are to dream so vividly? Why on earth are you complaining about it? I can't even remember my dreams. Think about it for a moment. At least you get entertained while you sleep. Me, all I get is a blank, very bland, uninspiring canvas in my head, like you see in an artist's studio, one that hasn't been christened with any paint yet. Me? No, I never dream.
Believe me, I'd lightly say, you wouldn't have enjoyed this dream one bit. In truth, it wasn't a dream at all. It was a horrible, horrible graphic nightmare, a gruesome one at that, about my father. But boy, I'm glad it was spurious.
That's too bad,
he would lightly say sympathetically.
But at least you know, Jamie, that your dream wasn't real. But I still say that you're better off than someone like myself, who doesn't dream at all. Even if sometimes your dreams are a tad ominous. It's all entertainment in my book. And good or bad, you're better off than if you don't dream at all.
Trust me, I'd insist, as I had done so many times before. Everybody dreams. I guarantee you that. In fact, I know you dream.
"If I do, it must be so riveting," Freddie would say, with a scathing sarcasm, accompanied by a humorous twinkle in his eye at the very same time. "Because I never remember them." "But that's normal," I would assure him. "A lot of people have absolutely no memory of their dreams. In fact, if the truth be told, I don't remember most of mine." There was no point in arguing with Freddie over this matter, because it was a battle I would never win. He was convinced he had never dreamed a day in his life. He put this odd peculiarity down to having no imagination. As far as he was concerned, it was only creative, visionary people who dreamed, like artists, poets, architects, and writers alike. But a man as methodical as he thought was incapable of dreaming. My husband was scientific, mathematical, a fact-based man, driven by the things he saw and observed with the naked eye, and the specimens he scrutinized every week under the slide of his microscope in the medical laboratory where he worked, in an environment where diagnoses, sometimes of the very worst kind, were made, but very often the news was good, when the specimens he received were both benign and non-malignant. My husband had never indulged himself in spurial, whimsical fantasies, and regretfully had never enjoyed the escapism of reading a fictional book a day in his life, which I think would have done him a world of good, but he wasn't wired to be that way. When he was an 8-year-old boy, he found his grandfather's Encyclopedia Britannica collection and read those giant-sized books from the beginning to end, like a selection of Nancy Drew novels. I mean, who in their right mind does that? It was a long-standing joke in his family, who found it heartily amusing, that an 8-year-old kid, who should be out and about, buoyantly playing with his friends and doing what other 8-year-old boys typically do, would be reading the encyclopedia. Freddie incongruously had taken it upon himself to read all this fact-based literature from start to finish, with the same kind of gripping enthusiasm some kids might direct towards reading Harry Potter. Indeed, his grandmother Doris had confided in me about Freddie when he was a little boy. She chuckled as she looked back on his childhood with a great deal of matriarchal affection. "Your Freddie, when he was 8, was completely consumed by those Encyclopedia Britannicas," she told me. She cocked her head of silvery curls to one side and let out an amused chuckle that made me smile. "To think that my husband so nearly threw those encyclopedias away. We bought them from a door-to-door salesman in the 1980s, who persuaded us that the Encyclopedia Britannica would quite literally change our lives. It would revolutionize us, he told us. It did not. We barely gave them any reference, you know. That was what you did in those days, you see, when Google was not easily at your disposal. Either that or visit a library to satisfy your hunger for knowledge, or to look up some facts. I remember my daughter Simone, your husband's mother, was doing a project on golden eagles. We had to take out books in the library to find out about the subject. Today it's just one click onto Google, and you get everything you can possibly need. How times have changed since then. Alas, those Encyclopedia Britannicas that set us back a lot of money. Well, they turned out to be useful, didn't they? They sat there on the bookshelf in my husband's study for years, uselessly gathering dust, until, of course, little Freddie came along, like a breath of fresh air to change all that. So maybe those encyclopedias weren't such a redundant purchase after all that. They brought our little Freddie countless hours of entertainment. When my husband told little Freddie that he could have those old encyclopedias to keep, he looked like all his Christmases had come at once, as if we'd brought him an expensive train set or something. He was absolutely thrilled. His eyes lit up like a Christmas tree. He told my husband that he was the best grandfather in the entire world for being so generous with all his old books, that I have to say he would have gladly taken to the dump. I mean, how many 8-year-old boys would say that to their grandfather if he gave them a set of Encyclopedia Britannicas as a gift? Conversely, they'd probably burst into tears from bitter disappointment for being given what they would likely consider to be a hideously repugnant present. Not Freddie. Never Freddie. He was always hungry for knowledge. He had this insatiable appetite for it, asking questions all the time, collecting interesting specimens of insects in glass jars, and studying them for hours on end. I do remember he thoroughly enjoyed growing all kinds of interesting, rather colourful moulds in petri dishes. Freddie was an idiosyncratic child. I'd never seen such a young child that wanted to know absolutely everything. He loved those encyclopedias, read them until they were literally falling apart like an old Bible that you've read far too many times. My husband said to me one day, "You mark my words, Doris, that grandson of ours is as bright as a button and as sharp as a hawk. One of these days he's going to be a scientist." And it seems he wasn't wrong. When Freddie was at school, his science teacher was in awe of how bright he was, always initiating the experiments in the classroom. One time, I understand, he actually caused a major explosion in the laboratory, shattering a glass window when he was young. But the less said about that, the better, I think.
I knew my husband's grandmother was right. She had summed up Freddie in a nutshell. Freddie loved facts like you or I might enjoy a good movie on a Saturday night. But that was my husband for you. And although he was now about 30 years old, not much had changed in that regard, as he was still consumed by facts, which was why he loved his job, working in a laboratory as a pathologist. Let me assure you, if me and my husband were sitting in front of the television, watching a quiz show, he almost always knew the answers to all the questions. But given he'd read many encyclopedias when he was young, and had the memory of an elephant, was that any surprise that he knew the answers? I don't think so. I would never have expected anything less from my husband. He knew some things that many of us would never even want to know. His sprawling knowledge was nothing short of impressive, even if some things he knew were probably rather useless in the grand scheme of things. But my husband, he loved it all. Many people thought he should have gone on that quiz show, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? Freddie was camera shy. He loathed any kind of public attention being directed at him, so that would never have happened. The truth was in my heart, as I stood there in my all-white glossy kitchen, with its pretty view over the front yard of our home in Nevada, where all the flat-roofed terracotta-coloured houses not only looked much the same, but were close together, in a built-up neighbourhood, scattered liberally with towering palm trees. I was clutching my cell phone so tightly in my hand that my knuckles had turned white. My bare feet on the white marble kitchen floor felt cold to the touch, even though it was quite warm. It would seem a chill crept through my cotton pyjamas that did not just come from the cold, but the freezing abominable revelations of the caller that had turned my blood into ice. I knew this was no dream. I was staring at the coffee I'd recently made. The mug was on the kitchen countertop, and the billowing steam was rising up above the dark concoction, and there was nothing illusory about this dose of reality, as the caramelized nutty smell of the coffee was incredibly pronounced. "Hello," came the voice of the caller again. "If you're there, Mrs. Bromaway, please answer me, or I'm afraid I'm going to disconnect this call and try phoning you again. It's important I speak with you, Mrs. Bromaway. There are things that need to be discussed. I know this is very upsetting news, and I'm grievously sorry for your loss." I knew I needed to reply before the caller disconnected our call, but there was a great big lump developing at the back of my throat, growing so big it was actually almost blocking my airways, so much so that I was almost choking. I managed to make some kind of absurd squeaking sound at the end of the phone, like a yes that sounded more like an injured animal that was crying out in pain. But at least it reassured the man that I was still at the end of the line. He sounded heartily relieved to hear my tormented bleats. "Oh, I'm so pleased, Mrs. Bromaway, that you're still there. I thought I'd lost you. Thank you for staying on the line. I know this must be very disconcerting for you, Mrs. Bromaway. There are no words.
Me and my wife, we're still trying to get our heads around this, and Sorry, I said, interrupting the man's smooth flow. Could you just repeat everything you've just told me again, from the very beginning? I'm not sure why I asked him to do this, but perhaps I was trying to reassure myself that what he'd told me was a floundering miscommunication, that I'd misheard, or somehow I'd got my wires crossed, so that maybe if he said it all over again, it would now be a new script, and the old narrative would have been flushed away, like a theatre producer telling the actors on the stage that the dialogue has been redrafted and the story subsequently changed. You want me to repeat everything I've just told you, Mrs. Bromaway? Yes, please, if you could. I'm not sure I heard you right in the very beginning. Everything you said, well, it flew over me. Well, that's understandable in the circumstances, Mrs. Bromaway, said the man, clearing his throat. He sounded uncomfortable, as if the last thing in the world he wanted to do was to recount what he'd told me only moments before. It was hard to explain, but I needed to hear absolutely everything again, every detail. It was important for me to assimilate his paradoxical, anomalous words, to make some kind of sense over what he was telling me. I braced myself for the impact of his dismaying revelations, as if a grenade had been flung at me through the kitchen window, and I needed to duck down for cover. My whole body was compacted with a compressed angst, almost as if I was wearing an 1800s corset that had been pulled in so tightly, with unforgiving ribbons, that rudely, with a merciless forcefulness, expunged all my breath away. I privately told myself to hold it together. I could crumble and fall apart after the call had ended, but now I needed to listen to what this man had to say. I needed to pay attention. All I wanted to do was to scream so loudly that even the glasses from the previous night that were drying upside down on the side of the sink would shatter from the vibration. I needed to establish all the details of what had actually happened to my father. I was clandestinely hoping that none of this was true. I drew in a deep breath that was so painful, as if I was drawing up oxygen that was contaminated with a vile, repugnant, thick, sludgy black soot that was poisoning my lungs. I told myself to try and be as dispassionate as possible as I listened to the caller. Otherwise his words would float past me like a balloon on the wind, and I couldn't let that happen, as grasping every detail was of paramount importance, so falling apart was not an option for me. I knew, of course, that people often held it together when caught up in the grip of a tumultuous, life-threatening situation, saliently extracting their family and animals from a burning building, perhaps. Indeed, people in the midst of any kind of gripping disaster did often remain calm and stoic, reining in their panic to get everyone to safety. In the same breath, even though of course the circumstances for me were entirely different, I knew I would be wise to do the same, as a methodology made perfect sense to me. As I was saying, Mrs. Bromaway, there is no easy way to say this, but as I informed you earlier on, your father has tragically passed away, in less than favourable circumstances. Me and my wife Peggy are incredibly sorry for your tragic loss. We send you our condolences and deepest sympathies. If there's anything we can do in regards to the matter, we would gladly help. We will always be here for you, Mrs. Bromaway, as any friend of your father's is a friend of ours. Your father was a very good man. He had a hard life, of that I know. Things were not always terribly easy for him. But one thing me and my wife Peggy know, Mrs. Bromaway, was that you were the apple of his eye. He talked about you with great fondness and affection. Graham certainly didn't deserve any of this to happen to him. But sometimes bad things happen to good people, Mrs. Bromaway. I've never understood this enigmatic conundrum, which is why so often I've had issues with my Christian faith. Sometimes a divine justice that some people call karma seems to be sorely missing in our world. Let's just say when you see evil thrive, you wonder where God is amidst all the chaos and discord. My Peggy believes that good in the end will always triumph over evil. I try to hold on to this, Mrs. Bromaway. Otherwise, none of this makes any sense to me at all. No, it can't be, I cried out. No, you're lying. You've got to be. This can't be true. You're wrong. My dad isn't dead. He's not dead. Why are you cruelly making all this up? Why? Why are you doing this? Regretfully, Mrs. Bromaway, I wish I was making this up. I am afraid your father is deceased, and I can't imagine how grievous your loss must be. But I don't understand, I blubbered. How can this be? What happened? What happened to him? That's a very good question, Mrs. Bromaway, of which I wish I knew the answers to. We do not know what exactly happened to your father. The coroner has never seen anything like it before in his entire life, and I don't say that with any exaggeration. We would have contacted you sooner, of course, but we did not know your contact details. We searched your father's house from top to bottom, trying to find them. It was like looking for a needle in a haystack, let me tell you. Luckily, my wife Peggy found your cell phone number in an old notebook we had initially disregarded and overlooked. It was gathering dust in the hall table, and that was our salvation. Your mother's number was in the book as well, so we contacted her. I understand you and your father have not spoken to her for many years, but Peggy felt it was significantly important for her to learn of your father's passing. It didn't seem right not to inform her. I hope we did the right thing there in telling her, and that we haven't caused you greater upset, he said gingerly. I squirmed as the caller mentioned my mother's name, the perfidious double-crossing woman I'd loved to hate for the last several years of my life, for she had hurt my father so badly with her traitorous behaviour that I'd found impossible to forgive. I cut her out of my life with a razor-sharp efficiency, and if I had never seen her again, it would have been too soon. My disloyal, fickle mother had cheated on my father with her personal trainer. They had sauntered off into the sunset together, to live happily ever after. Once my father had given her the divorce she had demanded. I'd never spoken or seen her since, and I didn't want to either. I'd always been close to my father, so his hurt became my own. My mother's disgusting betrayal towards my dad was also a breach of faith towards me, as far as I was concerned. My feelings towards her were less than complimentary. I had wantonly cut all communication off with her, but I suppose the caller was right, I thought rather begrudgingly. It was probably only courteously polite to tell her about my father's demise, as she was married to him at one point, and it wasn't right to keep this news from her. Well, rather you than me, you're right. You probably did have to tell her, even though I would rather she was kept in the dark. That's what we thought, said the man, sounding heartily relieved. I'm very glad you feel that way, Mrs. Bromaway. We were significantly worried. We know your relationship with your mother is fractured. We needed to find that notebook of your father's, you see, or we'd have been in a right quandary. Your father's cell phone with all the contact details was useless to us. We found it completely smashed up under the old oak tree in the front yard. I hasten to say it was as dead as he was, so we had no way of contacting you at all. So thank goodness my wife's ingenuity saved the day. This is where things get unpalatable, rather grisly, Mrs. Bromaway. So I hope you've got a strong cast-iron stomach, because I'm afraid you're going to need one. What I'm going to tell you next is not easy listening, and will not rest comfortably with you. The caller took in a deep breath and was hesitant for a moment, and then he spoke again. Your dad's deceased corpse was ripped apart, I'm afraid. His innards, entrails, and internal organs were torn up violently from a badly lacerated body. They were lying indiscriminately and haphazardly, dangling across the branches of the old oak tree in the yard. His legs had been wrenched off his torso, as were his arms. It was like they'd been yanked off him with a brute, unforgivable force. Every part of his scratched-up body was grotesquely displayed, like tinsel on a Christmas tree. It was the most appalling, barbaric sight I have ever seen in my entire life, like something out of the most abysmal crime scene drama that is being perpetrated by a psychopath. It just didn't seem real. It was so... The caller appeared to be looking for words. So ghoulishly macabre, he finally settled. Never seen anything like it before. As I was saying, Mrs. Bromaway, never. There are no words. It was repellently gruesome. I'm still suffering from PTSD from the experience, and had to get some tranquilizers from the doctor, as did my wife. A right state we were both in. I couldn't stomach my food for many days after your father's demise. This has hit us grievously hard. You don't unsee something like that. You never forget it. Even the crime scene police, who isolated the area at once, initially assuming a brutal murder had been perpetrated by a deranged nutjob, as based on first appearances, some insane, unhinged maniac was obviously responsible for harming your father. So they arrived at the scene looking more than a little bewildered and discomposed, especially when they witnessed the stark reality of what had happened to him. One of the men, dressed in white plastics, was violently sick, throwing up the contents of his stomach over everything. And he is, I am sure, one of those people that's attended a lot of crime scenes before. And so this might give you some perspective of just how gruesome your father's death really was. Me and Peggy couldn't believe that such a vile atrocity had been committed against such a nice, decent man like Graham. Mrs. Bromaway, I hasten to say I've seen ugly stuff in my life. Too much for a man that's approaching his 40s like myself to have to see. It's made me old before my time. I fought in Afghanistan in 2001, when the United States waged war with Al-Qaeda. So I've single-handedly seen the cruel brutality of what war brings. But the less said about that, the better. What happened to your father was completely horrific. I don't know how to tell you this, Mrs. Bromaway, as it's rarely going to upset you, but I believe you need to hear the truth. You see, I always promised your father when he was alive that should anything untoward happen to him, and he should suddenly die unexpectedly in unforeseen circumstances, that I would get in touch with you to tell you the news. He didn't want a policeman to have to come to your front door, as you can appreciate. He thought that would be tough on you. He wanted you to hear everything from a friend that knew him well, to soften the blow. I wonder if he had a prognostic sense of something bad going to happen to him, sort of thing. He asked me to do this for him not too long ago, I might add, about 6 months ago to be precise. It can only make you wonder. So in the harrowing circumstances, it was decided I should be the one to contact you. Mrs. Bromaway, just so you know, I've been your father's next-door neighbour for many years, 10 years to be precise. We both live on sizable plots of lands here in Montana. I'm your father's closest neighbour. I understand you've been meaning to visit him. I know he was hoping that this Thanksgiving and Christmas you and your husband Freddie would come up and stay with him, and not the other way round, which is what usually happens. He comes and stays with you in Nevada for 3 weeks a year, I'm told. But this time it was going to be different. We were all looking forward to it. My wife Peggy was going to create a marvellous feast for the all of us this Thanksgiving. Pull out all the stops, so to speak. It was going to be wonderful, a gathering of note, an opportunity for me and Peggy to get to know the both of you. And then this has to happen, to throw a spanner in the works. Your father talked about you all the time, Mrs. Bromaway. You have no idea. Anyway, he was very proud of you, he was. Me and Peggy were looking very forward to meeting you. Too bad it's going to be now in less auspicious circumstances, as you're going to need to come up to Montana. But the invitation for Thanksgiving still stands this year. We could have a memorial kind of get-together for your father.
That's so kind of you. It sounds like a fabulous idea, to have Thanksgiving together, to honour my dad's memory. Me and Freddie were looking forward to coming to Montana for Christmas this year. And Thanksgiving, of course, to stay with Dad. We were eager to see his cottage. I've never actually been to the place before, but Dad told me all about it.
I know my father loved his new home. When I was little, my father loved taking the family to Yellowstone National Park. He fell passionately in love with Montana. It was after my parents' ugly divorce that he wanted to heal his broken heart, so he decided to move to Montana, as the wild, rugged and natural landscape was very cathartic for him. My mother cheated on him, you see, with her personal trainer, but then I'm sure, as his good friend, you know all about that already. When my mother told him she was in love with someone else, that just tore my father apart. I couldn't believe her callous, cold-hearted cruelty, and the vindictive, insouciant way she threw him to the curb, spitting him out like old tobacco, because she thought she'd found someone better. It made me sick to my stomach, it did. You couldn't get a kinder, more caring man than my father. I never spoke to her again after that. I was so disgusted with her behaviour, and the way she wantonly abandoned my father. I hated her for that, as you can imagine. That's why I haven't spoken to her in years, and now you've been in contact with her.
I know all about that. Let's just say I could see your father was in a bad way, Mrs. Bromaway, when I first went around to his cottage to introduce myself to him as his new neighbour. He was in a sorry state, rather reclusive, underweight, thin and emaciated, very withdrawn, but Peggy soon put an end to his reserved, rather demure inhibitions. We got some flesh on his bones and brought him out of his shell. My Peggy can do that. She's got quite the way with people, you see. Marvellous woman she is, but you'll find that out when you meet her shortly. People talk to my Peggy, confide in her. She's especially good at keeping secrets, so people trust her. She used to be a social worker, so yes, your father talked to her a great deal, shared his heart with her, told her stuff I don't even know about. We would invite your father over to our place regularly. My Peggy doesn't like anyone to be out on their own, so we became close friends over the years, more like family, really. Your father reminded Peggy of her own dad, that she lost to cancer, so she was very fond of him. So yes, we've taken his death rather badly. It's far too close to home as well. There is more that I haven't told you, of course, concerning your father's demise. Unless you want me to spare you the details, Mrs. Bronaway. It might be easier that way for you. In my opinion, some things are just not worth hearing. And it isn't necessary for you to know absolutely everything if you don't want to. And that's perfectly understandable in the circumstances.
There's more. You haven't told me everything yet. I must know everything. I have to know everything. I insisted. This is my father we're talking about. I need to know what happened to him. Don't spare me any of the details out of politeness, even if they are repellent.
That's what I thought you would say, Mrs. Bronaway. I'm much the same. I'd feel the same if something happened to a loved one of mine. I would want to know all the details, no matter how gruesome they were. I'm afraid, Mrs. Bromaway, I need to warn you, this is not going to be easy to hear. Worse than what I just previously told you. Even my wife is shaking her head as I speak to you now. She is silently begging me not to tell you this. She's worried it's going to upset you, but I know you need to hear it, if you're anything like myself, which I feel you most certainly are. Your father's head, Mrs. Bronaway, had been plucked off his neck, was placed very strategically on the front doorstep, on the doormat, so that it would be found. I'm afraid his eyes were mercilessly gouged out, so the sockets were empty. His death looked like a vengeful, malicious, acrimonious killing, Mrs. Bromaway, as if someone wanted him dead, and was eager to make his end very conspicuous. Almost like a cautionary warning to others, you could say. As if whoever killed your father was saying, "Don't mess with me, or this will happen to you," if you get my drift. That was certainly the feeling I got from the scene, Mrs. Bromaway. I was the unfortunate one to stumble upon the gruesome sight, as we were expecting your father for dinner that evening, and he never appeared, which was most unlike him. Your father would have phoned us if he had wanted to take a rain check on the evening. Your father was courteous that way. I instinctively knew something was terribly wrong. Call it a hunch if you like. I went out to check on him, and that was when I discovered his decapitated head on the doorstep. I was so shocked I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I hasten to say I actually passed out for a while, and came to. And I've got a rock-hard stomach, Mrs. Bromaway. But this was hideous. I need you to know that the coroner, let's get back to the coroner, shall we, does not believe a human being was responsible for doing this to your father, which means there's going to be no further investigation in regards to the matter. Your father's death was not deemed suspicious. The police seem all too eager to brush it under the carpet, as if it never happened. The mind just boggles. I do know there were strange scratches all over the body. The flesh was torn up, gouged out by what looked like huge claw marks. There were bite marks all over the body. The coroner insists they are of a canine origin. I saw them myself. I gather short hairs that were very dark were found all over his body. They also looked to be canine under the microscope. Like some kind of wolf species, I believe. But let me tell you this, Mrs. Bromaway. A wolf could not have done this to your father. Whatever did this to him was a monster. I know this is going to sound impossible to believe, Mrs. Bromaway, and you probably do not even believe in such things. But my wife is certain it was a dogman that killed your father. She told Fish and Game as much when they came over to your father's premises to investigate the scene, especially after the coroner told them that your father had been mauled and attacked by a wild animal of canine origin. When Peggy said this to them, they shut her down at once, as if she was being absolutely ridiculous. But the suspicious way they reacted, Mrs. Bromaway, to your father's death leads me to believe they know far more than they care to admit. I think my wife is on to something. I really do. I mean, I've never believed in cryptic creatures myself, but now I'm not so sure. Let's not kid. Since I've lived out here in Montana, since me and Peggy moved into our cottage, strange abnormal things have happened to me and Peggy over the years. We've seen things, heard things that we could not explain. Your father always believed something didn't want him living in his cottage, but I told him he was talking absolute baloney. But now I'm not so sure. Maybe his gut instincts were right after all. I don't know what to think, Mrs. Bromaway, about his senseless death. It's outlandishly bizarre, paradoxical. As I was saying,
Are you telling me that Fish and Game actually came over to the property? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that's right. They were called out, as I was saying, to your father's property. They did a thorough search, armed to the nines with high-powered ammo, which suggested to me they were almost certainly looking for something. But they were not remotely forthcoming, very cagey, I have to say, and appeared ambiguously evasive.
I don't know what to say. That sounds absolutely extraordinary. Suspicious, even. I mean, why on earth would they arrive on my father's property with high-powered ammo if they didn't have a jolly good idea what they were actually looking for? My guess is they know exactly what killed my father. How long were they on the property for?
They were on the land from first light to late evening, searching the sprawling wilderness around these parts, with what I would describe as a fine tooth comb. But, of course, they found nothing. I knew they wouldn't. I have no idea exactly what they were looking for, but I have my suspicions. Let's just say their ineffectual endeavours were completely fruitless. It was written very revealingly over their tired, resigned faces that they had not been successful in their hollow, unproductive expedition. I hasten to say they were tight-lipped, cautiously circumspect. They were asking me and my wife all kinds of strange questions.
Really? What on earth were they asking you?
Well, if I'd seen anything queer or abnormal on my property. But given they were so remiss to tell me anything themselves, I told them nothing likewise. I mean, why should I? They had been very indeterminate and very vague towards us. Suffice to say, they warned me and the wife to be incredibly careful, always on our guard, especially at night, and never to go out into the woods late at night without our rifles. I get the sense they know exactly what harmed your father, but you know what these people are like. They're keeping storm. Call it an instinct if you like, but something like what happened to your father has almost certainly happened to somebody else. But they've been keeping it all very cloak and dagger, if you know what I mean. No one is allowed to speak of these things, or they shut you down. They pretty much warned me and Peggy, told us we were to tell anyone that asked that your father was killed by a bear. Can you believe that?
It's ridiculous because he wasn't killed by a bear.
Of course he wasn't. You will be very glad to know, Mrs. Bromaway, that I was very fortunate to see your father before he died. He was in jolly good form. He had dinner with me and Peggy the day before. The very next evening we were going to repeat the whole experience, this time playing darts and having dinner.
Oh, I see. So that's why you knew something was up, because he never rocked up. Is that what you're telling me?
That's exactly what I'm telling you. Your father never pitched. I went to find out what on earth was going on. What I failed to mention, Mrs. Bromaway, while we're on the subject, there was another thing that was also disturbing. It wasn't just the state of your husband's body that was found in such a disfiguring shape, but whoever killed your father really did a number on the cottage, breaking windows indiscriminately, damaging stuff, throwing mud and grass over all the interior space. I mean, there were drawers pulled out of cupboards, your father's things lying scattered haphazardly everywhere, and the mattress in his king-size bed had been attacked by a huge pair of claws, and the stuffing was lying all over the room. The cottage will need a little fixing up, I'm sure, so you'll need to go through your father's things. He told me once he'd left everything to you in his will, Mrs. Bromaway. I am very sorry for your loss, Mrs. Bromaway. Naturally, it goes without saying I will give you all the essential details concerning your father's body, and how to get in touch with the coroner about how to proceed from here. I understand your father wanted to be cremated, his ashes scattered in the meadow near the cottage. I know he loved that spot.
I appreciate you contacting me, Mr. Sorry, I don't actually know your name. How rude of me. My father did actually mention both of you on numerous occasions, but I'm so dreadful with names.
Oh, you must forgive me, Mrs. Bromaway. I do apologize. It's me that's being rude. The name is Falconer, Andreas Falconer. I've been your father's neighbour for the last 10 years. We bought our cottages round about the same time together.
Oh, yes, I seem to remember him telling me that.
Well, you see, in the beginning there were 4 cottages, built by the landowner on his sprawling ranch that he'd built for his 4 children. I understand he wanted his family, which meant his 4 adult children, and hopefully grandchildren to follow, living in close proximity to the main ranch. His plan was for them to live close enough to him, but at the same time to enjoy their own independence. I know his children were all grown up, but 2 of them chose not to live in 2 of the cottages on his ranch, moving far away from Montana, much to his disappointment. I believe 2 of his adult daughters had married men that needed to work in booming cities for their jobs. One of his daughters lives in Houston, I believe, the other in San Diego. The rancher's name is Atlas Angalis. Atlas is Greek and his wife Diane is Californian, which is why he moved out to America in the early 80s, after he met her on a visit to Greece. I think he comes from a farming family that grew olives for a living. I think oranges as well, perhaps, I'm not sure. I vaguely remember. You see, the Greeks, they love their families being together. They love huge gatherings. I don't know if you've seen my big fat Greek family wedding before, when it came out. It would seem Atlas's family's setup is uncannily similar to that. They occasionally have these huge get-togethers. Anyway, to cut to the chase, Atlas chose to sell 2 of the cottages on his land that he had painstakingly constructed for his children, where he assumed they would ultimately live with their respective families. It was not to be. Atlas, being a thrifty businessman, decided to sell those cottages, since they were lying empty. Your father brought one of them, and I brought the other one, that was next door to his, but on sizable plots of land, of course. So over the years we became good friends, being next-door neighbours as you do, if you know what I mean.
I know, Mr. Falconer. My father told me all this, how he came to buy the cottage. But I'm glad you reminded me of these details because I'd forgotten most of them. I thanked Mr. Falconer for his call, assured him I'd be seeing him and his wife shortly, and then I dropped onto the kitchen floor in a crumpled heap, sobbing my heart out. I was numb with the horror of it all. My father was dead. I was never going to see him again. The mortifying thought cut me to the quick. Something or someone, who might not even be human, had brutally killed him, with absolutely no regard for his life. I had cried an ocean of tears. I had got through an entire box of tissues. It was early on a Saturday morning, with the bright morning sun casting her gleaming shadows across our kitchen, so even the marble flooring became moderately warmer. My husband had seen that my side of the bed was empty. He had falsely assumed I'd gone out for a morning walk, as I was going to take our elderly next-door neighbour's beagle Sophie for a jaunt around our neighbourhood, as Mrs. van Rensburg was still unfortunately recovering from hip replacement surgery, so I was helping her out by walking her dog. My husband had taken a shower. He waltzed into the kitchen with a white towel knotted around his waist. He smelt strongly of lemon soap and coconut shampoo. He came into the kitchen to make some coffee for himself. He stopped short in his tracks when he saw my beleaguered, dishevelled form, propped up against the glossy white kitchen cabinets. I was blowing into a tissue, while a confetti of scrunched-up tissues were lying around me, like white peonies. I barely noticed my husband. I stared blankly into space with red puffy eyes, haunted by the horror of Mr. Falconer's startling revelations. It was bad enough my father was dead, but to be killed in such a grotesque, unseemly manner was not easy for me to stomach by any manner of means. On seeing me propped up on the floor, my husband almost jumped out of his skin, looking as startled as a rabbit surprised by the appearance of a fox.
"What the hell, Jamie? You gave me quite the shock. I thought when I saw your side of the bed empty this morning that you were out walking Mrs. van Rensburg's dog. What's the matter with you? Goodness gracious, your face is all blotchy."
Freddie dropped to his knees. He grabbed my hand in his to offer me comfort. His disquieted face contorted in concern.
"What on earth is the matter, Jamie? Are you all right? You're scaring me. Look at you. Your eyes are red. You've been crying. Oh, my word, you have, haven't you? What on earth is going on?"
He stopped for a brief moment to scrutinize me more closely, as if trying to read between the lines as to what could have happened to me to render me this upset. He stared at me, and then in a soft, wilted voice, he said rather gingerly,
"Has something happened to your father?"
I nodded, and then began to furiously sob. "My father is dead, Freddie, and it's worse than that. His body parts were lying dismembered across a tree, and his head was decapitated. It was placed on his doorstep strategically."
"Oh, my God,"
said Freddie, looking absolutely appalled. He threw his hand over his open mouth.
"Your father was murdered? Is that what you're telling me? Who would do this wicked thing to him? Graham was such a nice guy. Oh, I'm sorry, love. I don't know what to say. There are no words."
I began to blubber, my words becoming inaudible. "The next-door neighbour's wife thinks a dog man killed him. His body was badly scratched up by claws. There were canine bites all over him."
"Sweetheart,"
said my husband, lifting my chin up to his face, so my melancholic eyes met his. With a tissue he began to wipe away my tears for me.
"listen to me, Jamie. The next door neighbour's probably taking psychedelic mushrooms or something. Let me tell you, something for nothing if I may. There is no such thing as a dog man. The creature is a fictional fabrication that somebody's made up. It simply doesn't exist. But in the minds of the creatively inventive people out there, that's fine. They want to believe he exists. They can believe what they want to. But don't you believe a word of it. Some people imagine these crazy scenarios. But Jamie, a wild animal must have killed your father by the sounds of things. Maybe a bear. I'm sure a bear could pull a head off a body very easily, gouging out the eyes. It wouldn't be impossible in a bear attack. They almost always go for the face, and based on their strength and size, they can do a hell of a lot of damage, believe me, I know. If this was a mother bear with cubs, she could be capable of inciting great wrath on anything that she perceived imposed a threat to her younglings. Believe me, Jamie, there's nothing more dangerous than a mother bear. Do you know that Montana has the largest remaining grizzly bear population in the States? With, of course, the exception of Alaska. And those bears, well, they can be scary, even if sightings of them are rather rare. I believe it was likely a mother grizzly that killed your father. It would certainly explain the scratches over his body and the bites around his face. That is much more of a plausible explanation if you ask me." "Dog man," said my husband, smirking. "I've never heard anything so insanely ridiculous in my entire life. What will they think of next?"
"But you don't understand, Freddie," I retorted. "My father's head was connivingly placed on the front doorstep. The neighbour said it was like some kind of Machiavellian macabre message. And beyond that, my father's cottage was vandalised brutally. There was straw everywhere, mud, windows broken. Real mayhem everywhere."
"Sweetheart, I do not believe that your father's head being left on the doorstep was any kind of insidious message. Maybe it rolled onto the doorstep. As for the creature vandalizing inside the house, that does sound like a bear to me, especially if he was looking for food. And no doubt he would have smelt some on your father's property. Because you have no idea what a bear will do to get to food. Literally anything, causing mayhem in the process."
I knew better than to argue with Freddie, who really would never ever give cryptic creatures a passing thought. In his world they simply didn't exist. Everything had a rational, plausible explanation. I didn't buy into his thoughts concerning the matter, but there was no point in arguing with Freddie, because it would be a losing battle. Something had killed my father, and I meant to find out who or what it was, and when I did, I would kill it with my father's rifle to extract my own revenge.
"Are you sure you don't want me to come with you?"
my husband had asked me, as I packed the cupboards in our camper van, with the clothes I intended to take with me on the journey, for the 16-hour trip to my father's place. I had wisely decided to take the camper van that my husband happened to have bought 6 months ago, on a whim. I had decided I would live in our camper van, given my father's cottage was apparently in such disarray.
"I mean, don't you need me to be there for the funeral? I think I should be there, love, as a way of paying my last respects to your father. It doesn't seem right for me not to be saying goodbye to him."
I shrugged my shoulders nonchalantly and looked at my husband through narrowing eyes, avoiding his intrusive inquiring gaze, as I busied myself folding the clothes carefully into drawers. "There's no point in your coming with me, Freddie," I said obsequiously. "You're needed at the laboratory, aren't you? You've got a backlog of work to do. There are people out there relying on you, waiting for lab reports, eager to know their results. You don't want to hold them up, do you? Besides, you know that this isn't a funeral anyway. Dad would have loathed that. It's just going to be a casual affair. Peggy has arranged for a pastor to say a few words about him. Then I'm going to scatter, well, everybody's going to scatter my father's ashes in a pretty flowery meadow that my father apparently loved. Then all the people that have arrived on scene will be invited back to the Falconer's cottage for lunch, where Peggy has insisted on laying out a huge spread to celebrate his life. There's going to be a celebration, pig on the spit, I believe, salads and so forth. The Falconers have arranged it all. They love Dad very much. They're kind people. They've organised everything on my account. I'm incredibly grateful to them. As in my state, I couldn't organise a thing.
But that's the whole point, love, don't you see? I need to come with you. Won't it look bad if I'm not there? What kind of a husband would that make me?
Who's going to judge you, Freddie? I'm Dad's daughter, not you. If you're not there, nobody's going to be thinking badly of you. Why should they? We're not burying his body. I'm just throwing out his ashes. Well, we all are.
Yes, but you're my wife, Jamie. I feel I should be there to support you during this grueling time that you're going through. You need me, Jamie. You're broken at the moment. Look at the state you're in. Are you even fit to drive for 18 long hours? Or is it 16? I can't remember. Besides, I was very fond of your father. I would like to be there for him, Jamie. And for you, of course. Most especially for you.
He's dead, Freddie. We can't bring him back. You don't have to be standing over his ashes to honour his memory. You can say a few prayers or something for him.
Look, I know I'm swamped at the laboratory, but I'm sure they'd understand if I took a few days off to be with you. You're grieving, Jamie. You need my support. As I was saying, what kind of a husband would I be if I wasn't there for you?
I told you, Freddie. I almost growled at him. You really don't need to come with me. I'll be absolutely fine on my own. Freddie frowned at me.
Why do I get the funny impression, Jamie, that you really don't want me to come with you? You're giving me the brush off, aren't you? You don't want me there to show solidarity, to give you support.
Look, Freddie, I'll level with you. I don't want you to come all the way to Montana with me. All right, I admit it. I've got a lot of stuff to sort out at Dad's place, that's all. I'd rather do it alone if you don't mind, without you around. I might not hold my emotions together so well, and with you being around, I'll probably just fall apart. Besides, I have no idea how long I need to take at his cottage. It could be a lot longer than I'm anticipating. I need to clean up the place, to make it suitable to rent out. I don't want to sell it, as it meant so much to Dad. I'm going to have to talk to an estate agent about renting the place. My husband shrugged his shoulders, gathered me in his arms, kissing me on my hair.
My word, you do smell lovely. Is that apple shampoo? Look, I wanted to come with you, Jamie, because you're in a bad way at the moment. Your dad's death has taken a dreadful toll on you. I just wanted to be there for you. But if it's space you want, and you seem insistent about it, then space you shall have. Who am I to deprive you of that? I don't want to be cramping your style.
I know you mean well, Freddie, and I love that you care so much, but I do need to do this on my own. And I need some space.
Well, I appreciate that, then.
If my husband was disappointed, he hid it remarkably well. I did feel rather bad for pushing him away, but I couldn't help it. I did not want him to come to Montana with me. My husband believed a grizzly bear had killed my father. I did not. In truth, I wanted to glean all I possibly could about my father's tragic death from the Falconers. I needed to speak to Peggy Falconer privately. It would seem my father had confided in her with personal stuff that Peggy had likely not even shared with her own husband. If my father had told Peggy something in the strictest of confidence, I wanted her to tell me exactly what that was. My father was dead now. What was the point of keeping secrets, especially if it might help me gather more insight as to what had actually happened to my father? I also knew that if there was a dogman loitering around in the woods, I was going to personally take him down. I'd love nothing better to put a bullet through his skull given he'd killed my father. I wanted to extract my revenge, and I would stop at nothing to get it. I had been on a shooting range with my father once, in my early teens. The instructor described me as having an excellent eye and a natural flair, as I always got the target pretty close to perfect. I had even impressed my father, who described me as a natural marksman. I needed to search for this dogman, or whatever it was that had killed my father. If it had been a mother grizzly that had killed him, I would not want to kill her, because she was doing the most natural thing in the world, protecting her cubs. How could I hate a God-given instinct like that? If that was the case, I would never kill the mother grizzly, even if I encountered her in the wild. But I didn't believe a grizzly had killed my father, as Freddie so obviously did, which was one of the reasons why I never wanted him to come to Montana in the first place. I wasn't so scathingly sceptical about cryptic creatures. Granted, I'd never seen one, but I was open to the fact that they could easily exist. Maybe the difference between me and my husband Freddie really was down to the gift of having an imagination that my scientific husband badly lacked. I could envisage a dogman in my head very clearly, and believe in the likelihood of its existence, but my husband could not. I didn't need a doubting Thomas around to sever my chances to kill this creature. Don't get me wrong, I love my husband to death, but I needed him to accompany me on this fortuitous visit to my father's cottage like a hole in the head. I had to do this alone without Freddie, putting up barricades to halt my endeavours, which he would almost certainly do, especially if he knew I was frantically scaling the wood groves on this sizable ranch, on the off chance that I might discover this obscure thing that had lightly killed my father. I knew, of course, he'd worry that the grizzly that had killed my dad, which he suspected was the case, would also harm me, should I happen to encounter it. I hasten to say the trip to Montana went as smoothly as could be expected in the circumstances, with just a few hiccups along the way, when on one occasion I encountered roadworks, and on another a rather bad traffic accident, where the people narrowly escaped almost certain death, and were airlifted to hospital by helicopter. Beyond that, the journey was seamless. I was glad I'd brought the camper van with me, as Mr. Falconer had not remotely exaggerated the dreadful state of my father's beautiful cottage, which would need a lot of work to put it back into shape, but luckily most of the damage was just superficial. I was mortified to see the front door had been badly scratched up by claw marks that were in no way human. There were cracked windows throughout the house, and furniture scattered liberally all over the place, so it looked like a tornado had been invited in the cottage to maximize the damage. I knew I'd have to carefully sort through my dad's stuff. I would need to replace the windows and get the scratches on the door sandblasted away before it was suitable to rent again. There was a lot more to be done than I had previously anticipated, but once the cottage was knocked back into shape, it would be very charming indeed. My father had certainly chosen to live in a spectacular, rather prepossessing part of Montana. When I arrived at his cottage, both Peggy and Andreas Falconer were there to greet me, with magnanimous open arms. Tears were shed. The couple swaddled me with such warmth, insisting I join them for dinner that night. They were in their late 30s or early 40s, although I couldn't be sure of their exact ages, as Mr. Falconer looked more to be in his late 50s than approaching 40. When he walked over to me, to embrace me in a bear hug, I noticed he hobbled unsteadily on one of his legs. He observed that I had noticed this, and let out a rather amused chuckle. "You're looking at my leg, are you, Jamie? I lost the damn thing, would you believe, in Afghanistan during the war against Al-Qaeda in 2001. I didn't feel a thing, you know, when it happened. I was flung off my feet backwards, very, very suddenly. I remember looking down on my body to find I was missing a leg. The strangest feeling I've ever experienced in my life. It was so surreal. I guess the adrenaline stopped me from feeling any pain. That came later, and there was a lot of it, especially when I had to learn to walk, and a prosthesis was fitted, which can be very taxing on a stump, causing no end of rashes and inflammation. Do you know, Jamie, this hair of mine, he said, pointing to his frolicking grey hairs that bounced around his square-shaped face.
Well, it was as black as a raven's feathers at one time. But when I came back from Afghanistan, overnight it turned grey.
It's true, it did, said Peggy, chuckling. But I think you look very debonair, my love, with the grey hair. It really suits you. Mr. Falconer was tall and slim, with blue eyes and a Middle Eastern complexion, which he'd acquired from spending much time in the sun. His jovial wife Peggy was plump and cheerful, with dark curly hair that in certain lights gave off an enviable auburn hue. Her eyes were green and her skin fair. I was surprised it hadn't experienced any sun damage, living out here in the Montana wilderness.
Oh, it is so good to see you, love, said Peggy. Your father was such a wonderful man. He will be so greatly missed.
The following day many people I didn't know at all rocked up to celebrate my father's memory and the life he'd lived. Many of them were recent acquaintances that he'd made in Montana over the last 10 years since he'd moved here. All were naturally devastated that he had died so unexpectedly. Most assumed he'd had a nasty run-in with a mother grizzly bear. It would seem Andreas fed them that narrative that he'd been persuaded to use by Fish and Game. Ostensibly he also wanted to spare them the grisly details of what really had happened to my father. One of the mourners that arrived fortuitously at Peggy's house was my mother, whom I had not seen in many long years. My first unwelcome thought was, what the hell is she doing here? I bristled when I saw her.
I'm so sorry, love,
Peggy whispered to me, giving me a comforting nudge.
What was I expected to do? We had to invite her here to honour your father's memory, but we didn't expect her to accept our invitation. She seemed very eager to come.
My mother waltzed over to me, dressed to the nine in treacherous killer heels that could take a man's eyes out in a heartbeat if he wasn't careful. She was wearing a long flowing silken summer dress, covered in flowers that billowed around her heels when a touch of breeze teased the fabric. She looked ethereal and delicate, like a beautiful flower on a wild alpine field, only one that had manipulated nature far too much with a plethora of cosmetic procedures that had done their damnedest to hold back the cruel hands of time. But despite her very best efforts, it was easy to tell my mother was no spring chicken, even if her skin was as tight as the awning over a shop window. My mother was meticulously, if not perfectly groomed, with long nails as terrifying as her heels. My mother's brown shoulder-length hair had been heavily highlighted in different shades of browns. It looked rather fetching on her, I begrudgingly had to admit. In fact, she did not look half so bad for a woman of her advancing years, even if her skin looked as unnaturally smooth as that of a lizard. There was none of this aging gracefully with my mother. She would grab age as if it was a squirming rat and throttle it within an inch of its life so it wouldn't go anywhere near her.
"Hello, Jamie,"
said my mother tightly, a nervous smile twitching on her glossy scarlet lips. I was relieved she didn't gregariously throw her arms around me, for I'm not sure how I would have reacted had she done that. She knew better than to shower me with affection, and probably thought she had to walk on eggshells around me, which was likely true.
"It's good to see you, love,"
she said to me, her false eyelashes blinking as she eyed me a little apprehensively through her green eyes, as if she was terribly afraid I might spit poison at her and swallow her alive like a python.
"I knew you probably didn't want me here, love, but I wanted to come to say farewell to your father. It was the right thing to do, to honour his memory, to celebrate his wonderful life. Your father never would have wanted a funeral, but look how many people have showed up today to remember him. He'd have loved so many people being here to celebrate his life like this."
I glared at my mother defiantly, with a hostile expression on my face.
"Why do you care now when he's dead? You didn't care when he was alive, did you?"
I almost growled.
"It's a bit too late to care now, don't you think? You really have a low opinion of me, don't you, love? I'm not the monster you paint me out to be, Jamie. Granted, I'm not perfect, And I don't claim to be either. I admit I've done things in my life that I'm not proud of. But haven't we all made mistakes along the way? But show me someone that hasn't messed up, and then I'll show you a saint. Contrary to what you may believe, I cared for your father a great deal, she said, patting her heart. I was absolutely devastated to learn about the tragic way in which he died. It's too terrible for words, Jamie. I just cannot believe that a female grizzly bear did that to him. She pulled out a tissue from her leather purse and dabbed away at a few crocodile tears from her cheeks. Was she really crying, I wondered in disgust. She had walked out on Dad all those years ago, and now she pretended to care about him and was feigning tears. She deserved an Academy Award on her performance. You didn't care for Dad, I said scorchingly. Is this some kind of warped sick joke? The only thing that you've ever cared about, Mum, is yourself, and that personal trainer you married. Still smitten by him, are you? Still hopelessly in love with his six-pack and gargantuan biceps that would make Popeye cry with envy and feel he needed to eat barrel loads of spinach to just keep up with it? Now, Jamie, there's no need to be so cutting like that. If you must know, me and Piero de Marino are no longer together. The man was such a player, but I never knew that when we got together. He had such a wandering eye. What on earth was I thinking marrying a man like him, who doesn't know the meaning of the word being faithful? Sounds like you got a taste of your own medicine, Mum. Did he run off with someone else when he got tired of you? I said scathingly. Spit you out, did he, when he got bored? Jamie, must you be so tactlessly unkind? You really know how to dig in the knife where it hurts. All right, I will admit, said my mother, waving her arm in front of her face. I made a big mistake leaving your father. If I could have gone back in time, I would never have left him in the first place. I was just a little hasty. I thought I was in love with Piero. Can you blame me? Piero turned up the charm. He made me feel like such a princess, until he didn't anymore. He gave me so much attention, and I guess I just got swept up in the moment like you do. I was naive to believe all the stuff he said to me. Mum, do you realise how pathetic you sound? You dumped Dad for your personal trainer, and now you regret it? Dad loved you, Mum. He'd have moved heaven and earth for you, but you threw your marriage to the wolves, demanded a divorce, and sauntered off with his personal trainer, who charmed the pants off you, until finally he got bored of you. I knew it would happen. In the meantime, you broke Dad's heart into smithereens. Dad never recovered after you left. I don't think he ever got over your leaving, Mum. He really, really loved the bones of you, and I knew you'd never find a love like that again. That personal trainer only liked you because you were attractive, some eye candy he could show off to his friends to boost his ego. But did he care about who you were as a spiritual being? Absolutely not. I can tell you this for nothing, Mum. His attraction towards you was hollow, superficial, and shallow, as yours was towards him, I'm most sure. Don't you think I know that, love? And don't you think I regret it? Of course I do. I made mistakes, and I admit to them. I hope you're happy now. Piero was not who I thought he was. In the beginning, as I was saying, he was utterly charming. I thought I was madly in love with him as a result. But then the cracks in our relationship began to show, through the blistering veneer. I realized there was nothing to the man at all. I was so angry with myself for leaving your father. Your father would never have cheated on me like Piero did. How did you find out Piero was cheating on you? I said, raising a brow. My mother began to dab her face with a tissue, as if recalling the memory of Piero's treachery had made her break out in quite the sweat. Would you believe it, Jamie? I returned home one night, a day earlier from a weekend I spent with Sue Dyer. You do remember her, don't you? We were best friends in junior high together. Anyway, she wasn't feeling great, so I came home early. I found Piero frolicking wildly in the bed with another woman. And that was that. You can't unsee that kind of thing. I left him at once. I'm not going to put up with a man who treats me with such scant disregard.
I could have told you, Mum. Leaving Dad was the biggest mistake you ever made in your entire life. He'd never have cheated on you like that, because his love for you wasn't shallow. But you didn't appreciate any of that, did you, Mum? You've always been drawn to the superficial, the things that look irresistible on the outside, but are anything but. My mother started to blow, her nose rather loudly in her handkerchief. She looked pathetically sorry for herself.
Why did your father have to die like that? She grumbled. It's so not fair. Do you know we were communicating together again on WhatsApp for over 6 months? We were planning to meet up again, you know. It had all been arranged. I told him I regretted leaving him, that I'd made a monumental mistake. But he was hesitantly wary about meeting up with me again.
Well, can you blame him for that? I glowered. Once you've had your hand put through a mincemeat grinder, forgive me if you're a little reluctant not to want to do it over again. I couldn't believe my mother had contacted my father after all these years. When things fell apart with Piero, I mean, what a cheek! The audacity she had! She got lonely and started chatting with Dad again online. She was intending to rekindle the old flame with him. My mother was a piece of work. She'd likely spit him out like old tobacco if she thought someone better had come along. My father didn't need his heart broken twice in a lifetime. My mother was a man-eater. There was no other word for it. I knew that no one would have loved her like my father had done, but I'm glad that she never had the opportunity to reconnect with him again, as I guarantee you one thing, she'd have hurt him all over again. My mother couldn't help herself. She'd been through more men in her life than some of us have had hot dinners. When she met my father all those years ago, my mother had dated lots and lots of men before him, but she seemed to have settled down very happily when she married my father. But her restlessness began to rear its ugly head all over again when I was in my late teens, when she fell head over heels, hopelessly in love with her personal trainer, that had blown up in her face like a hand grenade, that I'd seen coming, even if she didn't. I had predicted the relationship with Piero would never last. If they'll do it with you, they'll almost certainly do it to you. Everybody knows that. My mother grabbed my hand with a desperate pleading look on her face.
Jamie, I'm so tired of us being enemies. You've cut me out of your life for over 10 years. That's a terribly long time, you know. I've missed you desperately. I'm your mother, for goodness sake. We shouldn't be waging war against each other like this, especially now your dad is deceased. It's just you and me now, against the entire world. We had some good times together when you were growing up, did we not? And then the moment that Piero and I got together, you willfully cut me out of your life. I know you were mad with me, and I can't blame you for that. But at the end of the day, when push comes to shove, you are still my beloved daughter. I want a relationship with you, Jamie, but you just threw me to the curb, without a by your leave.
That was before you decided to cheat on Dad. Can you blame me for feeling the way I did? Your behaviour was disgusting, Mum. Like an infantile, contrary teenager with a pathetic crush. And you were a grown-up woman, for goodness sake. Furthermore, I think you've got a cheek coming here today to bid farewell to Dad. My mother gasped, almost as if my abrasive, thorny words had cut her to the quick.
Jamie, that is most unfair. I cannot believe you've just said that to me. I was married to your father for 18 long years, I'll have you know, and I think that counts for something. I think as his ex-wife, I'm entitled to say my goodbyes to him, don't you? He was part of my life for a very long time. Even though we got divorced, I never ever stopped loving your father.
Is everything all right over here? Said Peggy, moving towards me and my mother. She glanced towards us circumspectly, almost as if she sensed the heated discord between the two of us. I think she was terribly afraid that we were going to have an altercation or throw a wobbly of some kind at the memorial. She was solicitously determined to throw water over the flames of our indignation. "Look," she said to us, with a diplomatic forthrightedness, "I'm well aware things are tense between the two of you, but I'm begging the both of you to put it behind you today, for Graham's sake. Lots of people have come here today to honor his memory. The pastor is going to say a few words. We're going to scatter Graham's ashes in the alpine meadow that he loved so very much, with all the butterflies and pretty wild flowers, along with the breathtaking view of the mountains. Everyone's going to have a handful of his ashes to scatter, to say just a few personal words for Graham. Then we're going to have a huge feast afterwards here at my home. And I just don't want any contentious quarrels or controversies between the both of you, unsettling everything. You don't want Graham's memory to be blighted by needless bickering, do you? Me and my husband would like this to be a very happy event. Graham would have wanted that." "Goodness gracious me," said my mother. "I assure you, I'm on my best behaviour today. You won't hear a hoot out of me, Peggy. I'm just thrilled to see Jamie again, that's all, and to have this quintessential opportunity to mend some bridges between the both of us. And, of course, most importantly of all, to honour the memory of my ex-husband, whom I loved very dearly." "Good. I'm very glad to hear you say that," said Peggy, looking heartily relieved. "Now I would like everybody to mix. Get to know the people around here today, the people who knew Graham. I'm sure they'd love to get to know the both of you. Graham made a lot of great friends here in Montana over the last 10 years, you know, and I know they'd be delighted to get to know you better." I'm afraid to say I barely remember the details of that day, as touching as it most certainly was, as everyone's generous tributes to my father made me break down in tears. I was very moved by the wonderful things people said about him, and the way he had obviously touched so many people's lives. Everything became a little bleary after that for me, as if some of the blurred memories had been wiped away, like the teacher's chalk on a blackboard. I do remember the pastor spoke kindly over my father. He was a man with a bald head that was so shiny it would make a man's impeccably polished shoes look scuffed, which I found privately rather amusing. I liked the pastor at once. He had a charming twinkle in his brown bird-like eyes, and looked to be a religious man of the cloth that didn't take life too seriously, and was prepared to have a good old laugh at himself. He certainly had an infectious sense of humour that made everyone laugh, which took out the melancholy of the occasion, and made the bleakness seem more bearable. But for me it was a struggle to get through the day, even though there was a celebratory note to it, as my father would have hated anything morbidly bleak. He'd always insisted he never wanted a funeral but a party, so we honoured him in the right way. As the pastor spoke, he appeared to be clutching the ornate turquoise and gold urn to his chest that contained my father's remains. I couldn't believe that that was all that was left of him. It seemed so pitifully sad. My father had been reasonably tall in life, taking up a great deal of space. Wherever he went, he often had to bend down in the doorway, if it was small, and now all that was left of him was a pile of ashes. We were all standing on what Peggy told me was my father's favourite spot in the alpine field, overlooking the panoramic smouldering mountains that curvaceously left their voluptuous signatures on the horizon, while a weeping, lugubrious gunmetal grey cloud cover hung over the mountains in a dense fog. The sky was so blue. A couple of white kites were crying out as they surfed the spirited wind current, so it was a dramatic moment when even the flowers in the meadow appeared to be dancing, as we bid my father our final farewells, with tears springing down people's cheeks, and even my mother's crocodile tears seemed surprisingly real. Maybe she did love him after all, in her own way, I thought. Everyone's clothes were being thrashed by the wind, but we stood our ground against the barraging wind current, like scarecrows in a field of corn. The wind howled as the pastor spoke, as if it too was registering the grievous tragic loss of such a kind soul that was loved and admired by so many.
We are gathered here today, on this beautiful day, I might add, with a mist cover over the mountains, with 2 kites soaring above our heads in the blue, blue sky, and with the flowers moving in the wind. It is a very beautiful moment like this, as if everything, even in the natural world, is honouring our Graham. We are here to remember this precious friend of ours, Graham, whom I have personally been very privileged to know over the last 10 years. And I will say this, that Graham was a man with a remarkably good sense of humour, and a vibrant, warm personality that was as large as he was tall. He will be sorely missed by all of us, for he made our lives brighter and more colourful for knowing him. We all took turns to pass the urn around and throw our ashes across the meadows, many people sending sweet messages to my father. The ash would rise up and dissipate before our eyes, melting into the wind until it was finally gone. I could only cry out, "Dad! Dad, I love you! I'm going to miss you!" And for a second, I almost felt as if I'd been enveloped in his warm, inviting arms, almost as if he was standing at my side, which was so comforting for me. The Falconers, of course, had prepared a fabulous party, delivering up to all their promises. There was some barn dancing in the yard around some haystacks. It was a delicious spread, upon which no expense was spared, as the extravagant food was incredible. Peggy was a fine cook. Finally the wind calmed, so the party was energised and encouraged to go on to full swing. The smouldering, delectable smells of wood smoke intermingled with the sizzling, aromatic, melt-in-the-mouth scent of pig on the spit, wafted invitingly into the air, teasing the appetites of our hungry guests. I was glad when the party was finally over. I could return to the safe, secure and familiar confines of the camper van, parked only a stone's throw away from my father's cottage. By now it was late afternoon, slowly but surely drifting into the early evening, although time had absolutely no relevance to me. I was emotionally spent. My mother bid me farewell earlier on in the afternoon. She had given me a loving kiss on the cheeks with a brush of her lips, leaving behind an indelible bright red scarlet stain that I hurriedly wiped away as quickly as I could, in disgust. "Jamie, my love, it's been marvellous to see you again. I will be in touch, of course," she said, and then she was gone, just like that. I felt only relief after she left, hoping it would be another 100 years before I ever saw her again. The revelation that she'd been in touch with my father again, coquettishly flirting with him online, made me nauseously sick to my stomach. If she had rekindled the old flame with my father, after all these years, I couldn't help thinking it would be like reopening an old festering wound, and making things 1,000 times worse. I was almost glad my father could not be subjected to a broken heart all over again, now that he was really gone. She could no longer hurt him. She had no power over him any more. And that was the only silver lining I could see on the grey cloud. When I got back to my camper van, I crashed in the bed immediately, as a tsunami of exhaustion simply overtook me. I slipped very seamlessly into a welcomingly deep slumber, incredibly glad to finally be back in bed, where I could easily escape from the world for a brief respite, disconnecting from my grief, like pulling the kettle out of the mains. I hadn't bothered to remove my jeans and sweatshirt for that matter, as tiredness had consumed me. It had knocked me out. Removing my clothes would have been a laborious, superhuman effort, as it completely defeated me. It must have been a few hours later when I was suddenly jolted out of my sleep with a rude awakening. I couldn't comprehend what had actually woken me up, but I felt rather shaken up and unsettled, like a baby's rattle. I could see that it was reasonably dark outside, with a full gossamer moon splashing her diaphanous injections of flattering light over the sky, so I could see reasonably well, although the window pane over my bed was rather small. It was like looking at a dark stage at a theatre that had been lit up by the lighting engineers with a flattering ethereal light. And that was when I realised why I'd woken up so suddenly, and had indeed been physically jolted out of my sleep. Something was moving the camper van up and down,
so that the van rattled precariously. Was someone outside my van, I wondered? And why were they shaking it like this? You'd have to be a hell of a strong to pull a stunt off like that. What on earth was going on? My exhaustion cushioned the blows of this very disillusioning moment. I sat up in my bed, and then I heard it again. There was a loud lamb-blasting thud and thump, and then the whole camper van began to spontaneously wobble and sway. Was someone standing outside my van? I wondered. Why were they shaking it like this? You'd have to be hell of a strong to pull off a stunt like this. What on earth was going on, I wondered. My exhaustion cushioned the blow of this very disillusioning moment. I sat up in bed, and it happened all over again. There was a loud lamb-blasting thud and then a thump. The whole camper van began to spontaneously wobble and sway, as if someone standing on the outside of the van was shaking it vigorously hard. What the hell, I thought, my blood turning icy cold. I felt like a sardine trapped in a can, that a hungry vagrant was trying to break open, so that he could get to the meat to easily devour. For a moment I cocked up my ears, trying to listen closely to any other sounds that I might hear, that might give away exactly what was going on. I suddenly had the weirdest sensation that a pair of insidious, rarely malevolent eyes were burning right into mine. My skin almost prickled with unease. I turned my gaze towards the window, directly over my bed, that only owned a pair of fake curtains. For a moment I jumped out of my skin. That was when I saw it. There was no doubt what I was seeing, for the magnanimous moonlight accentuated this creature all too clearly, so that the luxury of doubt was fully denied me. My heart began to leapfrog in my chest, thundering and booming so loudly, so much so that I thought it would spontaneously combust. Perspiration began indiscriminately breaking out over my lips and trickling down my back, like raindrops rolling down a glass pane. My eyes grew wide. My mouth dropped open. My breathing became furiously laboured, almost as if something was pressing down on my lungs so very hard and squeezing out all that life-giving air. For a second I wondered, am I dreaming? Peggy had suggested to Fish and Game that a dogman had killed my father. They had not reacted to her suggestion positively. Yet there was no question in my mind. I was seeing a dogman, staring at me brazenly through the camper van window, with its jaws wide open, displaying 2 rows of prominent, very sharp canine teeth, and there were globlets of gelatinous spittle dripping messily down its mouth and running down the window. It was thick and gooey, like aloe vera gel. The dogman had a face like a wolf, but there was a humanness to his gait, and he must have been hugely tall to be staring at me like this from the small window above my bed. I could only wonder how big he actually was. I noticed his hair was much like that of a short-coated German shepherd, and I could not discern what colour it was, but it seemed dark enough. Maybe a chocolate brown. I couldn't be sure. Bright red eyes like traffic lights glared at me menacingly. Then the growling began, similar to the sounds you might hear at a dog fight, as if the creature was about to attack me in any moment. But the only thing between me and it was the scaffolding of the camper van, that suddenly seemed pathetically fragile. I was tempted to cower and retract into the corner, begging God to make this monstrous beast go away. But when I remembered this creature had lightly killed my father, a surge of unbridled anger coursed through my body at the speed of a freight train. My fear dissipated as fast as the steam from a kettle. The creature had come to me like a gift from the gods. This was my quintessential opportunity to extract my revenge on this hideously repugnant beast. I had learned from this bitter, unenviable experience that anger can impolitely restrain fear, holding her to hostage. What I did next surprises even me. In hindsight, sometimes on reflection, I wonder what the hell I thought I was doing. The only voice that exploded into my head, like a cacophony of fireworks, is, "Kill it! Kill it! Kill it! This is the thing that killed your father." I had no idea what it wanted with me, but I got a profound sense it did not like my presence on my father's property, and was trying its level best to intimidate me, to get me to leave. Is this why my father had been killed, I wondered? Was this thing territorial or something? It seemed like a distinct possibility. By all accounts, my father's dead corpse had not been eaten by anything, only scratched up, badly lacerated, bitten and torn apart. The thing had not eaten my father, but had left his body visibly on display, like a macabre warning message. It probably didn't want to eat me, but wanted me gone. Is that why it was shaking the van so vigorously? Even though I never heard any audible words in my head, I got the sense that this creature was shrieking at me to go away, as if laying claim to my father's plot of land. The feeling was very clear to me, very unambiguous. I was in no doubt that this was likely the reason my father had been killed. I had taken the precautions to keep my father's rifle in the camper van with me, and so after putting on sneakers and a head torch, I peered out of the window above my bed. The dog man was still standing there, looking in at me, and growling. When he saw I was looking directly at him again, his eyes widened, and his jaws lifted to expose yet more of his teeth, almost as if he was smiling. The dog man seemed to have no intention of leaving me alone in the camper van. He seemed to delight in trying to intimidate me, with a design to scare me half to death, so that I would get the hell away from this place. That is what he obviously wanted. Moments later, I opened up the camper van door with a boldness that must have come from the gods, as it was not from me. Even though there was enough moonlight, things were still a little blurry, as they always are at night, and I began firing at the dog man with an unapologetic, careful, targeted spray of bullets. I hit him with one of my bullets, so he let out a huge, ear-piercing scream that rang louder in my ears than the bullets I'd actually fired. The dog man literally rocketed into the woods, with me following close behind it. But as I pursued my quarry through the trees, it disappeared from my sight, and was gone, all the while releasing loud, shrieking sounds that were so terrifying. But my fear had been bundled away in the back of my mind, and so I was not remotely paying attention to it. I returned to the camper van, feeling incredibly unsatisfied, rather like a hunter that has missed his target, and feels a sense of having failed in some way. We all know hunters aim to kill. Injuring your target is a very bad shot. Everybody knows that. If I had successfully injured the dog man, I could only hope it would bleed out, finally succumbing to its wounds and die. But I had a pervasive, discomposing feeling that maybe he'd only been slightly injured and grazed by my bullet, which was rather disconcerting for me. I would never be satisfied until I knew for sure that the dog man was actually dead, so that justice had finally been dealt out. I knew without a doubt that the creature I'd seen was responsible for my dad's death. I wanted to find it again, to ensure it was dead, gone from this world for good, but I knew I couldn't underestimate the robust resilience of this artfully Machiavellian dogman. He was clever, cunning, and far too fast on his feet to ever be able to catch, never mind actually find. This was the kind of creature you had to bring to you, not the other way round. No wonder Fish and Game had never found their quarry. This dogman could easily outsmart anyone he liked. The following morning I told Peggy and her husband exactly what had happened to me the previous night. They were appalled to see that my camper van was covered in unsightly scratches, gouges, and undulating dents that would require being fixed by the panel beaters. It looked like something had been trying to tear through the camper van to get to me, like battering a can of baked beans around, in the hope that the beans would finally burst out of their confinement so that they could easily be attacked. Had the creature hoped to do the same to me, I wondered? I didn't have to think about the answer to the question. I already knew it.
"Oh, my goodness gracious me," said Mr. Falconer. "This was the creature that must have killed your father. A dogman. Well, I never. More to the point, I can't believe you went after this thing, Jamie. It could have killed you. You reckon you hit it with one of your bullets? Well, I am impressed by your courageous conviction, I must admit, but at the very same time grievously concerned that you had the gall to do what you did. It could have backfired against you big time. I mean, look what happened to your father. He's much bigger than you are. You were playing Russian roulette with your life, Jamie. You need to be careful of things that you don't understand.
I know I got it with a bullet, Mr. Falconer. It screamed out in agonizing pain, so I did succeed there. But I think I only injured it. I didn't kill it. Call it a hunch if you like. But I only found a little blood scattered in the grove this morning along the trail. A few splatters of it here and there. That must have come from the dog man. But he didn't lose enough blood to die from his injuries, or I'd have found a greater volume of blood spill. If that had been the case. So I don't think he's dead.
We can only hope you're wrong about that, love, said Peggy. I mean, the creature screamed out in dreadful pain, didn't he? I hope you hit a major artery and killed him. Even if it ran away, my love, it doesn't mean it wasn't seriously injured. Oh, goodness gracious, Jamie, though. What were you thinking? You were crazy to go after the thing. My husband's absolutely right about that. It could have potentially killed you. I mean, look what it did to your father. Did you see what it actually looked like? She asked curiously. Or was it too dark to get a full impression of him?
Well, when I opened the door of the camper van, I knew whereabouts it was, as it had been staring at me through the window above my bed. It shook the van so hard, which was why I woke up in the first place. It wanted to get my attention. It was growling at me ominously. The moment I opened the door, I began to shoot in the direction where it had been standing. That was when it screamed out and ran off into the woods. It was huge. I mean, easily 7 foot tall, but thin and emaciated. It had a long, swishing tail like a German shepherd dog. It stood up like a human being on 2 feet. But then it dropped down on all fours like a dog after I shot it. I tried to run after it into the woods, but I knew I had no chance of catching up with this thing. It moved so incredibly fast. I know it killed my father. When it was looking at me through the camper van window, I got the impression this thing was furiously angry with me, enraged even. It wanted me to go away. It was territorial. It was looking at me as a trespasser or an intruder, if you like. I got this strange download, more a sense of knowing that this thing was laying claim to my father's land, like he was inadvertently telling me to get out. I could, of course, be wrong, but that was my feeling. Let me tell you, Mr. Falconer, if Fish and Game were looking for this dog man, I pity them. They'd never ever have found him. He's far too cunning. He's the kind of creature that could hide from you in plain sight, and you'd never even know he was there. And my bet is he'd even laugh at you. Mr. Falconer looked concerned. I'm worried, Jamie. Very, very worried. If this dog man is not dead, it could impose a more dangerous threat to you than ever before. An injured animal can be infinitely more threatening, believe me, I know. Especially one as intelligent as this thing is. It will want to avenge you, to get you back for hurting it. I hope you're wrong, I said, cringing at Mr. Falconer's ominous words. I turned my attention to his wife Peggy. I needed to speak to her about what my father had shared with her in private. I hoped I could get her to talk to me willingly. Look, Peggy, I said gingerly, I know my father confided in you. Did he ever tell you anything about this dog man? I mean, you seem to know exactly what had attacked and killed him when you were speaking to Fish and Game. If you know something, please tell me. Dad is dead now, so surely you don't need to keep his confidence any more. And besides, I am his daughter. I think I have a right to know if anything was bothering Dad before he died. It's important for me to make sense of everything, to piece all the puzzle together like a private detective, so I can understand why Dad was killed, so in some way I can make sense of it. Peggy shrugged her shoulders nonchalantly. You make a very good point, Jamie, dear. You better come into the house. I'll tell you absolutely everything I know. I followed her into the kitchen. She put on a bright red kettle on the gas hob, and when it whistled away she removed it, and prepared coffee for both me and Mr. Falconer. "So what did you think about the celebration we had for your father yesterday?" she asked, trying to lift the heaviness in the atmosphere. "Wasn't it wonderful? Everybody had a fabulous time, and everybody had so many wonderful things to say about your late father. We scattered his remains in such a perfectly marvellous place. I know your father would have loved it all." "I just don't know how to thank the both of you enough. It was absolutely perfect. The way those flowers were swaying so magically in the wind, and the kites flying above our heads, and the mist hovering over the mountains. It couldn't have been more dramatic. My father would have loved it all." "About your father," said Peggy, sliding over her coffee to me across the kitchen island, where I sat in the middle of both Andreas and Peggy. "He was very happy in his cottage, you know, for many years, until about a year ago it was, when he was tormented by very bad dreams." "Bad dreams?" I asked. I hadn't expected the conversation to take this kind of trajectory. I'd never known my father to be a dreamer. He was a little like my husband Freddie in this regard, and had never exactly been predisposed to dreaming. "Yes, that's right. Your father was experiencing very lucid nightmares. Terrible they were. So bad, in fact, that sometimes he would wake up screaming in pools of his own sweat. He said he'd see this man, very strange man in his dreams, with the face of a wolf and glowing red eyes, telling him to get the hell out, to leave the premises at once. It was like a kind of foreboding for him." "You mean he was dreaming about the dog man that I saw, instead of actually physically seeing it? Is that what you're telling me? How does that even happen?" Peggy held up her hand to silence me. "Well, there is more to it than that, Jamie, dear. It gets worse, I'm afraid. Your father would frequently experience sleep paralysis, where he'd feel something sitting on his chest, pressing down on him terribly hard. So much so that he could barely breathe at all. He was absolutely terrified. This happened to him on numerous occasions, I'm afraid to say. Indeed, it was so real to him, he was almost afraid to go to sleep. He was beginning to think the cottage was haunted by a demonic entity of some kind that he'd been seeing in his dreams, that looked to be half man and half beast, that wanted him out of his home, like some kind of a possession, if you know what I mean." "Wow, that's incredible," I said, gasping. "Dad felt as if he was being haunted. That's what you're telling me." "That's an excellent way to put it, Jamie. I couldn't have said it better myself. We decided to call a psychic over to his cottage to see if he could discern, or she could discern, what was going on with all the nightmares, and if they had any relevance to any paranormal activity that might be going on in his cottage, and somehow interacting with your father through his dreams. Your father wanted something done about this. I guess he sensed that there was more to his nightmares than actually met the eye. I never told Andreas any of this stuff," she said, looking at her husband apologetically. "I thought he'd think it was hocus-pocus stuff and nonsense. But your father, he was in a right state, Jamie. He desperately needed help of some kind, and I was determined to get it for him." "Don't worry, Peggy. You should see my husband Frankie. I'd have done exactly the same with him. He'd have found this whole thing insanely ridiculous. He wouldn't believe any of it. If you want to know why he never came to the memorial service, was because I discouraged him to come here. I just knew he'd never ever buy into this dogman stuff. He's convinced Dad was killed by a grizzly bear, but we know differently. And after last night's encounter with the critter, I know that that thing killed my father, because I've seen it with my own eyes, and they did not deceive me. I know what I saw. This thing is dangerous." "Let me guess," said Andreas, looking at his wife sceptically, as he took a large sip of his coffee. "You called around that woman to Graham's cottage.
You're more predictable than you know, love. I can see through you like a glass pane. What's her name, that woman that looks like a gypsy, with all those jangling gold bangles she wears on her arms, and the long flowing skirts? What's the name? He said, furrowing his brow. Ah, yes, Ishma Solisha. Is that who called you? The woman is as batty as a fruitcake. They say she's a real Romany gypsy. Lives in an old battered caravan in the woods. People go to her for psychic readings. They claim she's got the gift. They insist she's no charlatan. She likes to barter with people, you know. Never ever accepts money for her readings. You have to pay her with goods like giving her a chicken or a pig. She says if you pay her money, she will lose her gift. She's most insistent about that. Batty she may be, my love, but that woman is definitely psychic, said Peggy. Of that I'm in absolutely no doubt. Yes, I gave her a massive barrel of honey in exchange for her to come over to Graham's cottage and investigate what was going on. Do you know she told Bert Coltrane to get his mole on his arm checked because he had black energy in that area? He had the mole removed. It was cancerous. So whatever you may think, Andreas, she does know her stuff. She sees energy fields and auras around people in very specific colours, and each colour tells her something about their energy. She knew just by looking at me that I get migraine headaches and have a few digestive issues. How could she possibly know a thing like that when I told her nothing? I'm not here to argue with you, love, about what this woman does or does not know, or whether she is genuinely psychic or not, said Mr. Falconer, raising a brow. We want to know what happened when she came to see Jamie's father at the cottage, don't we, Jamie? What did she make of the nightmares that, Graham was experiencing? This is going to be interesting to see from a psychic's perspective, I suspect. Well, she was incredibly accurate, said Peggy. I was very impressed. She drew a picture of the dogman that your father was seeing Jamie in his dreams. Your dad acknowledged that this indeed was the beast that was causing so much disturbance to him. She did she? Said Mr. Falconer, unable to hide the abject surprise on his face. It was obvious he'd thought the Romany gypsy was not the genuine deal, and wantonly just exploited people in exchange for things by telling them absolute nonsense. But for her to draw what my father had been seeing in his nightmares certainly confounded Mr. Falconer. Peggy took a big sip of her coffee and said very gravely, She told your father, Jamie, that the dreams he was experiencing were no dreams at all, nor was his cottage haunted. But the thing that he was seeing in his dreams was very much real, was flesh and blood, and wanted him gone from his cottage. She told him that the critter had communicated with him through some kind of transfer of knowledge. The psychic went around the property pointing out what she described as purple heat signatures, which we could not see or smell, but she informed us that this dogman had sprayed the trees with his urine to mark his territory, and it was all around your father's property. She told your father that this dogman had even used some of his energy to almost strangle him in his sleep to intimidate him, so that he experienced that dreadful sleep paralysis. She told your father that he was in grave danger, and that if he didn't move away, that this dogman would likely kill him. He had made his message very clear to your father, and she said he was losing patience, was very angry, and wanted your father gone from the land, which he believed most emphatically was his.
But why, I asked. Why did the dogman believe the land was his?
She didn't know the answer to that question, love, said Peggy sadly. She thinks there may be an energy field on the land that is highly attractive to the dogman. She said your father needed to get out of the cottage at once, if he knew what was good for him. which of course was not remotely practical. Your father wanted to stay there, so it was like a stalemate between your father and the dogman.
But didn't the psychic have a plan to help Dad get rid of this dogman? I mean, aren't they good at giving advice in this regard?
Yes, they are, my dear. But the advice they usually give you is about the paranormal. This was completely different. But as it happens, she did give your father very good advice. But would he listen? Absolutely not. I hate to say this, Jamie, but if your father had paid attention to her words, well, he'd likely still be here today. She told him she would call for spiritual help on his behalf, to get rid of the dogman once and for all, but it could take some time for this help to arrive. She advised your father to leave the cottage for a while. I told him he was more than welcome to stay with us for as long as he liked in our granny annex, but he would hear none of it. Your father, I suspected, valued his independence far too much. The psychic said what she was going to do was send out telepathic communication to Selenka. I hasten to say I have absolutely no idea who Selenka is. All this stuff was beyond me. She told me we would know that the help had arrived when there was a big boulder placed on the front doorstep. It would mean the dogman had been dealt with and the problem gone away, so that your father could once again reclaim the cottage. She said Selenka knew exactly what needed to be done, and was very good at sorting out these kind of things. But with the rituals and the fasting, it would take a while for him to get there. So if she did call for spiritual help, I have no idea, because it was a long time in coming. We've never found a boulder on the doorstep to affirm that the help had come, and the dogman problem dealt with. So I don't know what went wrong there.
I could kill Dad. I really wish I knew that this was going on. If I had any inkling that he hadn't listened to the psychic's advice over this matter, if I'd known that Dad was being pursued by a dogman, I'd have made him listen to her. Now, because of his stubbornness, he's actually dead.
Well, you're very right about that, Jamie. The psychic warned him that he would almost certainly die. It was a guarantee if he didn't leave at once. The dogman had made his intentions very clear. Your father valued his independence. He refused to allow the insidious creature to scare him away from the property, to bully or intimidate him. You know what he was like. He was resolutely stubborn.
Peggy began to mop her brow as she continued with her story.
It was days later when your father told me he was physically seeing the dogman, not just in his dreams this time, but in real life, always late at night. That sounded alarm bells for me in my head. Let me tell you, I knew then that things were getting way too out of hand. He said it would stand there at the living room window, night after night, while your father watched television, staring at him with glowing red eyes, would growl at him warningly, banging the walls of the house. And you know what your father did? He just ignored him. But he had been warned, but he didn't want to leave that cottage. I was very angry with your father, Jamie. I really was. I tried my damnedest to knock some sense into him. I wished to God he would listen to me. I told him over and over again to come and stay with us until we found the boulder on the front doorstep, and were assured of his safety. But he refused to leave the cottage. His words, I believe, were, "This is my cottage, and I will be damned if this beast thinks he can turf me out of my own place. That is not going to happen. I will kill him myself if I have to." You know what your father was like, Jamie? There was no getting through to him. Well, can you blame him? Mr. Faulkner interrupted. It's ridiculous, a dogman trying to throw Graham out of his own property. If Graham had confided in me about this matter, I would have killed the creature for him myself. With the greatest of respect, love, I am sure you would have if you'd believed him. But after everything that happened, you now believe a dogman killed him. But back then, you would have thought this was all absolute nonsense and was in Graham's head. It's only because of the strange idiosyncratic events concerning his death that you've come around to the idea that a cryptid creature like a dogman has indeed killed Graham. Before that, you'd have thought such an idea completely ludicrous. That was why we never told you about what was going on. We knew you wouldn't believe it. Well, I am very disappointed that you and Graham chose not to confide in me. Yes, I admit I probably would not have believed a word of what you were telling me, but at the very least I would have investigated to assure Graham that nothing was going on, and if I'd found that dogman, I would have taken him out myself. But now it's too late to be of any help to him, because he's gone. And as for that gypsy woman, who fancies herself rather too much if you ask me, I don't buy into any of this bizarre stuff. What does she think, that she's some kind of archangel that can fix everybody's problems? It's absolutely ridiculous. Well then, why were you so impressed that she drew a dogman, explaining what was haunting Graham's dreams? How could she have been so right about that, if she wasn't psychic? You cannot dream this stuff up, Andrea, you know. If she was fake, how could she possibly have known all this? People do have extraordinary abilities, you know. Do you know that in World War II they used ESP in the form of remote viewing to see what the enemy was getting up to? Through psychic ability, they found out exactly what Hitler was doing. If you don't believe me, you can look it up for yourself. Well, I cannot answer your questions, love. It's all very confounding and confusing for me. I feel as if I'm caught up on a bizarre board game in an alternative reality. Everything you're saying sounds so woo-woo. It's hard for me to assimilate it all. But I know for a fact that it wasn't a damn grizzly bear that killed Graham. So did those men from Fish and Game. I do remember, Peggy, when you asked them if a dogman had killed Graham. Their revelatory faces and defensive body language told me all that I needed to know. The eyes can tell 1,000 unspoken words in that moment. I knew that dogman was real. But this creature physically reaching out to Graham in his dreams sounds so woo-woo to me. But if people were able to do this in World War II, I guess who am I to argue with such things that I myself fail to understand? Let's just say there are obviously more things on heaven and earth than actually meet the eyes, that I'm reluctantly beginning to accept. Of course it sounds woo-woo, love, said Peggy. It sounds utterly incredulous. There was no doubt that this thing was causing Graham a great deal of grief, but it had telepathic abilities. It was able to transfer its warnings to Graham in his sleep and impose an image of itself on his mind. These things have supernatural powers beyond our understanding. But it doesn't make it any less physically real, you know. As for help, the psychic was insistent it would come, once she'd called this Selenka. But she had to perform several rituals in order for Selenka to pick up her message. She was adamant that Selenka would easily get rid of the problem for Graham. She said Selenka had helped her before many times in the past, but the silly man refused to listen. And on the subject of refusing to listen, Jamie, I hope you are not going to be mulishly stubborn like your father was. I mean, look what happened to him. I'm not happy about you, Jamie, leaving your camper van parked outside your father's cottage at night, with that dreadful thing loitering around, especially after your unsettling interactions with him last night. If he killed your father, He will likely do the very same thing to you, Jamie. You must stay on our property in your camper van, far away from your father's cottage. I must insist. That dogman damaged your camper van. He woke you up in the middle of your sleep. He wants you gone from your father's premises. And now that you've lightly injured him, God knows what he's capable of doing. I think my wife is very right there, said Mr. Falconer. Last night you could have been killed. I have absolutely no idea what you were thinking so brazenly going after that dogman with a rifle. Things could have gone badly pear-shaped for you. I mean, look at you. You're no more than 120 pounds, and this thing is infinitely more powerful than you are. It could take you down in a second. It probably never expected you to courageously go after it in the way you did. But this time, if you tried the same trick on him, he'll be ready for you. And we know what that thing is capable of, after what happened to your father. I will spare you the gruesome details, but you do get the picture, don't you, Jamie?
I can't believe you're saying that, Mr. Falconer. You don't know what I was thinking. How can you say that? If this thing had gone after your Peggy, you'd have gone after him too with a rifle. Don't forget this thing killed my dad, Mr. Falconer. Do you realise that I'm not going to let it get away with it? I bet it's still out there. I know I didn't kill it, and I want it dead.
Of course you want it dead. We all do. We're on the same page as you, Jamie. No one can blame you for feeling overwrought, but you mustn't do anything silly or impulsive. Remember, this dog man is artfully clever. If you hurt it last night, as I suspect you did, he'd be after you again. Do you understand that, Jamie? He would want revenge. I don't doubt it for a second. It's not the sort of creature that is going to turn a blind eye to your injuring it. The fact that it shrieked out in pain means you hurt it badly. It's a thinking, feeling creature with human-like characteristics. It obviously has outer-worldly powers, being able to communicate telepathically and plant thoughts and images in one's mind. You must remember, Jamie, this thing is not like your average wolf that will run away if it perceives a threat. It's wired completely differently, and my guess is if you hurt it, it'll want to hurt you. If you stay in your camper van on our property, you'll be out of his way.
I nodded reluctantly. I knew Mr. Falconer was absolutely right. I'd sort out a few of my father's affairs during the daylight hours and clean up the cottage, but during the evenings I'd get the hell away from my father's premises to avoid a nasty repeat of last night happening all over again. I couldn't get rid of the clawing urgency within me to exterminate this thing, for the insatiable indignant rage I felt towards it for killing my father was insurmountable. Yet at the same time I was fully aware of my own limitations. I might be skilled at taking down a deer, perhaps, or even a fast-moving wild boar, but this was an entirely different ballgame. Killing a dogman was no walk in the park. According to Mr. Falconer, even Fish and Game had arrived on his property, looking as if they were about to take down Al-Qaeda. So they must have believed the dogman imposed a very grave threat indeed. I was practically fantasizing about putting a bullet through its skull, but I doubted my ability to succeed with such an enterprising mission. Even my anger had its limitations, and was it really worth putting my life in jeopardy to go after a dogman, even if it was to avenge what it had done to my father? I had spent an entire day trying to sort through my father's stuff. It was such a huge job, bigger than I'd anticipated. I spoke to my husband Freddie on my cell, who asked me about how everything was going. I told him all was fine, brushing everything that had happened under the carpet. For if I had told him the truth, number one, I doubt he would have believed my outrageous claims, and number two, if he thought I was in danger of any kind,
He'd fly up to Montana in a heartbeat and be urging me to get away from this place as fast as possible. And I'm sorry, but that was not going to happen. There was a lot I needed to do first.
So how are you, love? How are things going? I'm glad all is well, he said to me, but I'm missing you. Please hurry home. It's lonely without you around. The place feels like a morgue. I still feel bad about not being there to pay my last respects to your father. It didn't feel right being miles away. I really think I should have come, you know.
I miss you too, Freddie, very much. But I have to admit I'm glad you didn't come. It's all been very traumatic losing Dad. And your being here would give me an excuse to blabber all the more. And I'm barely holding it together as it is. This has been a tumultuous time for me, Freddie.
Well, when you put it like that, love, maybe it is a good thing that I didn't come. But I'm missing you. I hasten to say, love, that Flapjack isn't remotely impressed with being fed by me. I'm giving him exactly the same food you give him, but he seems less than charmed with my presentation. That cat of ours is incorrigible. He's obviously missing you very much.
That evening I spent the evening with the Faulkners, enjoying a hearty home-cooked meal and playing cards with the lovely couple. All of a sudden exhaustion rose up in my stomach like a tidal wave. Let's not kid, grief can take absolutely everything out of you, like squeezing all the water out of a dry sponge. Indeed, I had cried so much after my dad's death, I don't think there was a tear left inside of me. I had become like a dam, ridden by a dreadful drought. Soon the yawns started, and Peggy immediately began to apologize profusely for keeping me up so late. She genuinely felt annoyed with herself for not being more aware of my overwhelming fatigue.
Goodness gracious me! I really should mind my manners, Jamie. Look at you, dear. You're absolutely zonked. We've been keeping you up far too late. Would you prefer to sleep in the spare room than your camper van? You know you're more than welcome to sleep there. And if the truth be told, it'll give me a peace of mind knowing that you're in the house, because that thing could still be loitering around the place, even on our property. Supposing it comes looking for you, it is a possibility, you know. You could be more vulnerable in your camper van. It just suddenly occurred to me that this could be the case. I have no idea why I didn't think about this before. You already know the answer to that question, Peggy, said Mr. Faulkner, giving me a big wink. You know Jamie's a Chipperfield block. She'll want to sleep in the camper van. She's fiercely independent, much like her father was. Peggy looked rather unsettled about this. I'm being serious, Andres. What if the dog man comes onto our property and attacks Jamie in her camper van? I doubt that's going to happen, love. I mean, he doesn't know Jamie's on our property, does he? Don't you know anything, love? Said Peggy, looking heartily annoyed at her husband. It's a known fact, love, that dogs, wolves, and bears have one thing in common, don't they? An extraordinary sense of smell that would make our sense of smell almost redundant. You know, whenever we go camping, we always have to lock our food away because of bears. They can smell out food from miles away. The dog man may know Jamie's on our property, staying there in the camper van. There's no doubt about that in my mind, now I come to think of it. He could smell her. Why do you think the police cadaver dogs can smell the location of a dead corpse? Because they have a sense of smell that can pick it up from miles away, even if it's buried deep beneath the ground. Goodness gracious me! I can't believe I never thought of all this, said Andreas, looking visibly concerned. You make a remarkably good point, love. Look, Jamie, I don't want to be a miserable wet blanket or to lay down the law, but Peggy is absolutely right. The dog man will smell you a mile away. He'll know you're here. He may be pleased that you've evacuated your father's property, But after you injured him last night with a bullet, he could turn up here to wreak revenge. He'll smell you. I know he will. He'll be here tonight. It's almost a guarantee, if you ask me. It's much better if you sleep in our house. That way you will be safe."
"Very well," I agreed. "I'm too tired anyway to argue. I'll sleep in your spare room, if it makes you feel better. And actually, now I come to think of it, it makes me feel better too." Peggy looked heartily relieved, as if a weight had been lifted off her mind. She patted her brow with her handkerchief to mop away the dampness. I noticed she always seemed to break out in a sweat when she was anxious about something. Since I had arrived in Montana, Peggy had been fussing around me like a mother hen that clucks over her chicklets. Then again, she was like that with absolutely everyone, the matriarch figure who everyone leans on for encouragement in times of trouble. It didn't remotely surprise me that my father had chosen to confide in Peggy. She was the person of upstanding moral rectitude that would take your secret down to the grave with her, which was why I was so glad she had told me what had happened to my father. It couldn't have been easy to betray a confidence like that, especially one that sounded so incongruously bizarre. Ostensibly, when she had heard about my father's dreadful nightmares, she had gone to the moon and back to try and help him. I was only grievously disappointed that the spiritual help the psychic had called out for had not been forthcoming. Alas, there were no boulders on my father's front doorstep to signify that the dog-man had finally been dealt with. I didn't fancy my chances of success in killing the dog-man. I suspected last night, when the creature had been jolting my camper van and peering in at me through the window above my bed, that it would assume that I would cower away in a corner. It had not anticipated being showered with bullets. I clandestinely suspected that my fortuitous boldness had caught him off guard, but not any more. The next time around this thing would be ready to lash out at me, and given what it had done to my father, whom had probably not succeeded in harming it, God knows what it would likely do to me. In truth, I was glad of the sanctuary of the Falconer's house, rather than lying there in the camper van, feeling like a sardine in a tin, very, very vulnerable. Furthermore, I had no idea what superhuman powers this dog-man actually possessed, for he had communicated with my father in his dreams, so he was capable of a great deal of manipulation. I didn't trust myself in my current emotional condition to be left to the mercy of a creature like this, that was capable of asserting much damage.
Andre Falconer's account. I was heartily relieved that Graham's daughter Jamie had agreed to sleep in our spare room in our cottage, given what had happened to her the previous night, while sleeping in her camper van on her father's premises. Jamie not only witnessed the menacious, formidable dog-man for herself that had killed her own father in a gruesome, appalling way, but she had boldly, in a moment of impulsive madness, gone out of her van and showered this thing with bullets, taking him off guard. She had clearly managed to inflict some damage on the critter, but not bad enough to actually kill him, which was asking for trouble, as this intelligent creature could be back again to wreak its revenge on her, and of that I was sure. I knew the creature was not dead. I had investigated the trail myself. I had taken the trail through the trees, and noticed that the blood spillage was minimal, and was certainly not enough to cause the death of the creature, so he was more than likely very much alive. I was, of course, secretly impressed with Jamie's boldness and rather irrational courage to go after this thing. I don't know many women that would take a dog-man on like she had done. A while ago I would have laughed at anyone suggesting that such a cryptid creature actually existed here in North America. But now I knew differently, and my arrogant presumptions had taken quite the beating. To all intents and purposes, the way the body of Graham Bromaway had been so badly defiled, brutally spread all over the place, was not the work of a grizzly bear. Granted, bears might attack the face with scratches and bites, causing a great deal of damage for sure, But never would they barbarically display the body in a vengeful way, like a member of the mafia would, to send out an insidious message, warning people to keep away from the premises or else, like a great big red warning sign. I know the medical responders that arrived on the scene knew that Graham's death was not the work of a grizzly bear. People arrived on the scene very quickly, claiming to be Fish and Game, and I say that with a big question mark, for I have no idea if they really were who they claimed to be. But they arrived on the scene to search the area thoroughly, armed with high-powered rifles that were incredibly intimidating. I knew that they were not after a simple grizzly bear, but something infinitely more threatening. They told me to contact them at once if I saw anything on the property, giving me cause for concern. They gave me a phone number, but I had no intention of ever calling them. I needed to take this dog man out myself. I had fought in Afghanistan. I was qualified to do this job single-handedly, and I was reasonably confident of success. If, of course, I operated on a clandestine approach and caught this thing off guard. Failure to do so would mean this thing would slip through my fingers like butter. From Janie's account of the previous evening, this creature could run like greased lightning. It isn't easy to take down something moving fast, unless you're a very skilled marksman. The most sobering part of this whole wretched business was I knew this territorial dogman's presence was very disquieting. It might choose to stretch out its territory further, over a larger area, as it became increasingly more cocky, arrogant and presumptuous. And this wider area might later include my own property, which would mean that me and my wife Peggy could potentially be in grievous danger. Furthermore, when new people were to rent out Graham's property and move in, it would not be safe for them to live there, with this thing loitering around in the dark shadows. I had become certain that the dogman would likely be sniffing around Jamie's camper van this evening to wreak his revenge. I would be hiding in the shadows to take him out and be done with this hideously grotesque creature once and for all. I didn't keep secrets from my wife Peggy, but I knew it would greatly alarm her if she knew I intended to take the dogman down myself single-handedly. So the less she knew about the matter, the better. Jamie had told me that the dogman had been peering in at her in her camper van at about 1:10 in the morning. So I knew it chose to loiter around the place in the late hours of the night and early morning, when most human beings were blissfully fast asleep. I told my wife Peggy that I wasn't remotely tired and intended to stay up to watch television, so that I had the perfect excuse not to change out of my clothes or return to bed. "You want to stay up watching television?" she asked, eyeing me up and down rather suspiciously. "I'm just not tired, that's all." "You could have fooled me, love. I could swear I saw you yawning earlier on. Well, if you're sure you want to watch television, who am I to argue with you?" She kissed me good night on the cheeks, and I was relieved to see her climbing up the staircase, returning to bed. I set my alarm on my cell phone to wake me up later. I was in no doubt I would fall fast asleep on the couch. The exhausting events over the last few days had worn me out, but a light sleep would do me the world of good. It must have been at about 20 to 12 when my alarm went off, jolting me rather rudely out of my restless slumber. When I awoke, I felt rather disorientated, but then I remembered what needed to be done. Before long, I was creeping silently out of our cottage, with my rifle in my hands and several rounds of bullets on my person. I felt almost as if I was travelling all the way back to Afghanistan and was on another night mission. I cautiously slipped out of the house so silently. My background training in the military had taught me all about the advantages of stealth, and I was very skilled in this manner of cautious approach, ensuring that nothing or no one could detect me, as the element of surprise gives you immeasurable advantage over your enemy. I'd even taken the initiative to spray myself with something that is used to iron out human scents, so they're not easily detected by wild animals or indigenous peoples that can smell the white man with effortless ease. I was glad that the wind was blowing in the opposite direction from where I was hiding, so if there was a trail of any human scent lingering on the ether, it would be less likely to be detected. I decided to silently position myself behind a tree, very close to Jamie's camper van. It was an old ash tree, with a swagger on it that would have made the dancers on Strictly Come Dancing appear to be rather stiff. I instinctively knew that this dog man would be back sniffing around the camper van. It was clearly mad with Jamie for having injured it in some way. It would seem that my hunch paid off exponentially. My heart began to pound wildly in my chest. I observed a heat signature from amidst the trees, moving towards me, with a dog-shaped head and a humanoid body. It was easily over 7 foot tall, and appeared to be obliviously unaware that something infinitely larger in size than he was, with a distinctive pyramid-shaped head and humanoid body that appeared to look like a Bigfoot, was stalking it with an impressive stealth that would have made the military extremely proud. Could this night get any weirder, I wondered? I was still trying to acclimatize to the rather peculiar fact that Dogman was indeed very real. And then I observed another heat signature on my night goggles that bore an uncanny resemblance to a Bigfoot. It appeared to be shadowing the Dogman as it moved cautiously through the trees. Finally, the Dogman reached Jamie's camper van. It was gingerly sniffing around for scent signatures and peering into the camper van window that overlooked Jamie's bed. And boy, was I very glad she wasn't sleeping there tonight. I had no light source at my disposal, as at this point I'd switched off my headlamp, but I was very grateful for a generous pearly moon that confiscated the dark shadows, so that I could see the Dogman very clearly. It took my breath away. I felt as if I was caught up in a bubble of a Jurassic Park-type world, where cryptic creatures were purging through the veil of our reality and making themselves very visible. I was coming face to face with my doubts and disbeliefs, almost as if the universe was having a laugh at my expense and saying, "Get your head around this. These things are real." I was trembling in my boots, I have to admit, as I observed this malevolent-looking Dogman. The creature was gangly, on the thin side, with ugly ribs creeping through his rather grim-looking coat, like the gnarled roots of an old tree. He circled the van and hobbled precariously on one of his legs, clutching an area on his upper thigh that appeared to be hurting him, where I suspected he had been hit by one of Jamie's bullets. The Dogman began with a brute, powerful force to shake the camper van vigorously hard, as if he was trying to turn it on its side. I kept telling myself, "You need to kill this creature at once." I had forgotten about the Bigfoot, and was trying to take aim at the Dogman, who thankfully appeared oblivious to my presence. All of a sudden there was a formidable, loud roar, and before I knew it, the Bigfoot had whipped through the trees so incredibly fast. I was amazed at his impressive speed, for one so powerfully large. Everything happened so quickly, like it always does on the action movies, when a sniper takes down a group of drug lords in a single shot. The Dogman, on seeing the Bigfoot, was filled with terror, and I'm not surprised, for he was no match for this Herculean-sized creature. This Bigfoot was easily over 10 foot tall, was so enormously powerful, with a face that was handsomely rugged and incredibly human-looking, and with one powerful, forceful hand he grabbed the Dogman. The creature let out a shriek. I think he knew his number was up, and with one huge pummel to the head, the Dogman went down. The Bigfoot just twisted his neck until the Dogman lay limp. He then threw the dogman over his shoulders, glided away, disappearing into the night, and I was filled with an incredible sense of awe, and of course a huge sense of relief. The following morning I discovered a huge boulder had been placed outside Jamie's father's house. This thing was so large you couldn't move it, but so visibly attractive that it remains there to this very day, with some climbing flowery foliage growing over it. I realized the psychic medium had indeed called for help, and that Selenka was very obviously a male Bigfoot. There was no doubt that peace was restored to all of us, knowing that the Bigfoot had rescued us from this monstrous dogman, that I believed was territorial, for reasons maybe we will never know, and maybe I don't want to know either. Jamie returned home with the camper van that left her husband Frankie confounded. The panel beaters were also rather startled by the way the camper van looked, but Jamie wasn't saying anything. We make a very special point of seeing both Jamie and her husband Frankie every year for both Christmas and Thanksgiving. Jamie has never told her husband Frankie about the dogman, and in her shoes I wouldn't tell him either. Some things are best not revealed. Frankie is the kind of man driven by scientific fact. Mentioning cryptic creatures to him would likely only make him scoff and think you were rather delusional. I understand, of course, where he's coming from. I used to be like that myself, until I saw these things that I cannot describe to a non-believer. Jamie has been letting out her father's premises to tenants, and has no intention of ever selling the cottage, as it helps her to remain connected to her father. Recently the tenant, a 35-year-old woman, found a gargantuan footprint outside her house. I knew when I saw it it came from the Bigfoot that I'd seen that night, but I said nothing to her. My guess is he's surreptitiously keeping a watchful eye over the place. I'm glad to say that Jamie's repaired her fractured relationship with her mother. I believe they're getting on better these days. It will seem her mother has found a new love, as Jamie predicted she would. I have no idea what this new love is like, and I don't really want to know. I just hope for Jamie's mother's sake he's not a player like Piero was. I'm glad the woman didn't have an opportunity to hurt my good friend Graham, as I suspect she would have done. Some people just can't help themselves, can they? So there you are. That's my story. Wow, that was an incredible story. And wasn't Jamie brave to take on that dog man, because I would never have done that. I'm afraid I would have cowered in the corner and just willed that thing to go away. Oh, goodness gracious, that was a very dangerous thing for her to do. But I'm so glad that the Bigfoot came to the rescue and got rid of that dog man, because that dog man was getting way too territorial and was clearly very dangerous.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.